Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku's Quirk Had a Dark History. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Inko was working on dinner when she received a phone call. After setting the knife down on the counter, Inko pulled out her phone. Without even needing the caller ID, she already knew it was her husband. "Hey Hisashi, are you headed home from work?" Inko said, familiar with this routine, as her husband liked to always call her whenever he was driving home. A weird habit only Hisashi had, as all her friends' husbands rarely did anything of the sort. Most days it was just routine, but sometimes it was a helpful reminder of when dinner needed to be ready. "I am honey, but I have good news. I got a call from the hospital a few minutes ago. Kaina just came out of labor," Hisashi said as excitement filled his voice. "Our nephew was just born." Inko froze as the news entered her mind. She had to go over it a few times before everything made sense. Once it did, she screamed. "Wait, what do you mean? Kaina already had her baby. But he wasn't due for another week. And how are you acting so calm?" Inko knew she should be excited for her sister, as this was the day the three of them had been waiting for since Kaina first learned she was pregnant. Yet to hear the news so suddenly, Inko's worrisome mindset was acting up. Honey, everything is okay. I'll be home to pick you up in a few minutes. Then we can head over together. I'm sure your sister will appreciate our company," Hisashi said, reassuring his wife that everything is fine. Yet he was failing. As Inko had been talking to him, she had turned off the stove and ran into the nearest bathroom. Grabbing a comb, she began to brush out of the mess she had since waking up. As she brushed her hair, she said, "No, Hisashi, everything is not okay. We were supposed to have a week left to prepare everything. Most of everything won't be ready until Friday. Hisashi, it's Monday." Hisashi laughed a little. "Inko, Kaina, and the kid most likely won't be discharged until Thursday at the earliest. We still got some time to make sure everything is in order. I'm pulling into the neighborhood right now." Inko's panic rose even more, and she dropped the hairbrush. Unfreezing, she dove up her makeup bag and began searching for lipstick. She wanted the delivery to be perfect, to have everything ready for when her sister and nephew left the hospital. "Honey, what did I just hear fall to the ground? And what did you just unzip?" Hisashi asked. Though he had grown accustomed to how easily his wife could panic at the smallest things, this was almost assuming. This was a time when her panicking was becoming a bigger issue than what she was panicking about. "You realize that we were supposed to have dinner with Mitsuki and her husband tonight. Katsuki has given them a whole night's rest yet, and isn't supposed to for another 2 months," Inko declared, having read all the baby care books so she could help out her friends. "I already told Masaru, and he informed his wife. They're fine, they'll order some takeout," Hisashi said, then realized his mistake. Inko stopped as she did too. "Hisashi." Her voice took a tone as if she was right to tear himself apart like she was an apex predator. "You mean to tell me that you informed the Bakugus of the situation before you informed me? Your wife and sister to Kaina." "I'm sorry," Hisashi said as if begging for his life. Which he basically was doing. But he couldn't tell if it was working. "I'm pulling up to the house right now." That seemed to make Inko refocus. Forgetting the lipstick, Inko splashed some warm water on her face and then ran out of the bathroom. She hurried down the hallway and slid through the living room, using her quirk to pull her purse into her hand from the couch. As she did so, stopping at the front door, she knelt down and slipped on her shoes. Once the laces were tied, Inko ripped open the door and dashed out. After barely remembering to lock the door, Inko took off down the walkway. As she reached the road, Hisashi pulled in from the house. Sliding across the hood, Inko threw the passenger door open and got in. Then, without so much as a hello or any kind of greeting, Inko looked at Hisashi and said, "Drive." Knowing it was in his best interest to obey his wife's command, Hisashi put his foot down on the gas and tore down the street. Working on getting to the hospital quickly, while making sure not to get pulled over, Hisashi could see the worry growing on his wife's face. "Inko, everything will work out fine," Hisashi said, but noticed that she didn't seem to hear him. She didn't seem to be paying attention to anything around her until Hisashi pulled into a parking spot and turned the car off. As if the chair was going to shock her, Inko shoved her door open and leapt out of the car. Hisashi had to work fast to get out of the car. As he got away from the car, he looked down the parking lot and saw that Inko was already by the elevator and had pressed the button. Moments later, the elevator dinged and the door opened, forcing Hisashi to run to make it in time. He barely made it, having to squeeze in right before the door closed. He had to lean against the railing to catch his breath. He looked at Inko and said, "I don't want a word out of your mouth. I'm not the one that trained to be a hero. I feel like I'm about to have a heart attack. I told you, you should start going to the gym more than once a month," Inko said without taking an eye on the light that indicated which floor they were on. She was barely winded despite having done more running than her husband. Hisashi shook his head as he stood next to Inko. Once they reached floor 6, the door opened and Inko began to move forwards, only to be slowed by her husband. Keeping his arm intertwined with Inko's, Hisashi walked Inko up to the reception desk. "Hello, welcome to floor 6 of Shizukoa General. Who are you here to see?" the receptionist asked, looking up from her computer. "Kaina Tsutsumi," Inko said, wanting to see her sister and her nephew. "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name," the receptionist said, without looking at her computer. Hisashi smirked a bit. Despite Kaina being Inko's sister, Hisashi knew more about the political world of heroes than Inko did. Hisashi knew Kaina wouldn't use her real name, as whenever a heroine got pregnant, they usually did their best to keep it a secret. And Kaina had done her best to hide her pregnancy. The fact the photos the media managed to get of her were always from a distance helped, making it hard to see her baby bump. Not that she really had one. Then try Kara Midoriya. Were her sister and brother-in-law, Hisashi said, giving the name he had helped Kaina set up in preparation for all this. The receptionist smiled as she did a quick look over at her computer. Then she stood up and gestured down the hallway. "She's in room 628. Please be quiet. She hasn't had much time to recover." "Thank you," Hisashi said with a nod, then pulled Inko away from the desk. As they walked down the hallway, Inko's demeanor changed. "Hisashi, are we ready for the responsibility?" Inko asked, hugging herself. Hisashi stopped, then turned around and said, "Nope, let's go home. I'm sure your sister will be fine." Hisashi began walking in the opposite direction. But before he could get too far, Inko used her quirk and grabbed Hisashi by his shirt collar. Once Hisashi felt his shirt start to pull him back, he stopped and chuckled. He then turned and walked back to Inko, placing an arm over her shoulder. "We've done everything we can to prepare, but for things like this, sometimes your best isn't to be prepared for everything, but doing your best to adapt to the unknown." Inko hugged Hisashi and cried a bit into his shirt. Hisashi hugged Inko until she stopped crying. Once she stopped, she looked up at her husband, and he asked, "Are you ready to go in?" Inko nodded, so together, they took the last few steps to room 628, where Hisashi knocked on the door. A few moments later, a voice called out, "Who is it?" The voice sounded exhausted, but unable to sleep. "It's Inko and Hisashi," Inko said, in a calm voice. "Inko, it's good to hear your voice. You can come in, if you leave your baggage in the hallway," the voice said, with a little humor in it. Hisashi gave a fake laugh and opened the door. "Obviously you're not that tired if you're able to joke about that." Hisashi and Inko walked in and saw Kaina leaning against her bed. Her breath was slow and her eyelids were half closed. She tilted her head and despite being very pale, she gave a small smile as she saw the two. "Hisashi, I'm going to be able to joke about that on my deathbed," Kaina said, her smile turning into a smirk. "Come on you two, let's not go there right now," Inko said, as she walked over and gave Kaina a little hug. "It's good to see you again. How was everything?" Kaina nodded her head over to a small tub that had a blanket poking over the edge. "I was barely in labor for an hour. It seemed like the little sucker wanted to come out," Kaina said, then noticed the worry on her sister's face. "Inko, he's fine." Despite being a week early, the doctor gave him a clean bill of health. "So what are you thinking about naming him?" Hisashi asked, walking over to the tub and looking at the newborn that lay inside. The newborn was wrapped tight in a swaddle and was fast asleep. "I thought I would leave that up to his parents," Kaina said. Inko took a shuddered breath and almost fell to the floor. "Inko, that's why you left training. You wanted to have a family, something you have been trying to have for 3 years now." "That is the whole reason I carried him." Inko looked her sister in the eyes and asked, "Are you sure?" Using all of her strength and willpower, Kaina leaned forwards and gave her younger sister a hug. "I'm sure. It's not like my work will give me the time to be a proper mother. I want him to grow up with that in his life." Kaina broke the embrace and looked Inko in the eyes. "Hey, that doesn't mean I won't be there when I can." I'm the one that went through all this. I'm going to see him grow up. So what are you going to name him? Izuku Midoriya, Inko said, walking over and seeing her nephew for the first time. Inko looked back at Kaina, who simply nodded. 3 days later, Kaina and Izuku were discharged from the hospital. As Hayashi was unavailable, Inko picked them up and drove them home. At Hisashi and Inko's house, Inko carried Izuku while slowly walking next to Kaina. Unlocking the front door, Inko helped Kaina through the living room and to the ground floor guest room. After skillfully slipping Izuku into the bassinet that had arrived early, Inko sat down on the bed next to her sister. Together, they sat on the bed in silence for a few minutes. Do you remember the day you told me you weren't going to train with me with the Hero Public Safety Commission anymore? Kaina asked, then took a small drink of water. Yeah, at first you seemed disappointed, but then you smiled and gave me a hug. You told me that I should follow my own path, no matter how different it was from yours. Inko said, looking at her sister. Kaina nodded and looked like she wanted to say something but didn't. Instead, she chose to say, You seem so happy. I never saw you smile as brightly as when you talked about Hisashi. I hope you two will always know how much I love seeing you together, despite how often Hisashi and I butt head. I know you do, Inko said, giving Kaina a mischievous grin. Kaina chuckled and lightly punched her sister in the arm. Over the coming months, Kaina worked herself back into top shape to go back to being a pro hero. Once she returned, she held a press conference telling everyone that she had a family issue that took all of her attention. As Izuku grew, Kaina visited him and her sister as much as she could. However, with her agency only 2 cities away, her visits were not as often as she wanted to be, becoming less and less frequent as she got back into being Lady Nagant and the HPSC giving her more missions. Yet she tried her hardest to see her son. But that all stopped one day. On that one fateful day, when the world she had disillusioned herself with shattered with a single gunshot. Izuku was 4 years old when it happened. His mother Inko was taking him to the local park to start the weekend off right. As they walked into the general area of the park, Inko's phone went off. Inko pulled her phone out and saw she was getting a call from Kaina. Curious about what her sister might want to talk about, Inko answered the call and held the phone up to her ear. However, before she could say a word, Kaina yelled, Inko, thank God you picked up. What's wrong, Kaina? Why are you calling? Inko asked, immediately noticing the stress of worry in Kaina's voice. Inko felt herself begin to worry about her sister worrying, so she had to take a few deep breaths. Inko, I need you to listen to me. What I'm about to say is going to be confusing, but I need you to listen to me, Kaina said, sounding out of breath. That made Inko extremely worried, as she hadn't heard Kaina lose her breath. Not after training with the HPSC. Kaina wasn't out of breath because she was tired. No, she was stressed. Inko could feel herself start using the training she got alongside Kaina on how to deal with stressful situations. All right, what do you need to tell me? You're going to see my hero name in the news in the coming days. It will probably be about a fight I had between some other pro heroes. Just know that whatever they say isn't the truth, Kaina said in an anxious tone as the wind rushed by, making it hard for Inko to hear her sister. Then what is the truth? Inko asked, hearing gravel being moved from Kaina's end of the call. That told Inko that her sister was being chased. But from who and why? Is that Aunt Kaina? Izuku asked, tugging on Inko's pant leg. It is, honey. We're in a serious conversation right now, and she needs to tell me something, Inko said, then just heard Kaina sigh a sad breath of air. What is the truth, Kaina? I'm sorry, but it's better if you don't know the whole story. Just now I'm going somewhere and I'm gone for a while, Kaina said. Inko's mind deciphered the code as Kaina was going to get arrested. My God, Kaina, what did you do? Inko asked, looking around as if someone was hunting her and Izuku. She scanned the crowd, a new couple walking their dog around the park, a street vendor selling snow cones. Just other people doing normal daily tasks. None gave off malicious intent. I'm sorry I can't tell you that. But there's something you can promise. Do you know how we talked about the future when Izuku starts to ask specific kinds of questions? Do you remember that conversation? Kaina asked as she caught her breath. I do, Inko asked, grabbing Izuku's hand and pulling him over to a park bench. Her eyes are still scanning the crowd around her. A few new people had shown up, but still, none seemed to have the intent to harm Inko or Izuku. You remember how we would bring up our situation and explain the truth to him? About everything, Kaina said. Her voice was still stressed, but it seemed to be calming down a bit. Talking to her sister always calmed Kaina down, no matter what was stressing her out. I do. Inko said as she looked down at Izuku. I need you to promise that doesn't happen. Whenever Izuku starts asking those questions, tell him whatever lies will convince him the most. Anything but the truth. It would be best if he knows. It will save him from a world of pain and hurt. A legacy he doesn't need to be a part of. Can you promise me that? Kinda asked. Inko took in a sharp breath, and then asked, Why? Why are you asking me to do all that? I know right now that this all sounds confusing, but when you hear the lies of the media you'll start to understand. For now, all I can tell you is it would be for the best if you and your family didn't have any connection to the name of Kaina Tsutsumi or Lady Nagin. As my younger sister, can you do that? Kaina said. Her voice sounded like metal being sharpened. Just tell me why. Why do I have to promise this? And I'll agree. Inko said. Yet Kaina didn't answer for a bit. Inko could feel her heart rate skyrocket as she waited for her older sister to answer. Inko looked around the crowd. It was clear her sister was hunting. Maybe she was too. Their relationship wasn't publicly known. Only those from their childhood knew Kaina and Inko were sisters. Inko never really wanted to become a hero. That's why she married Hisashi and quickly told his last name. She just wasn't meant for the limelight. But both sisters loved each other too much just to leave each other behind. Finally, Kaina answered Inko's request. Just a single sentence. I'm sorry I won't be around, lil sis. But we trusted the wrong people. Inko's world shattered as she heard her sister say those words, then to hear the phone call disconnect. Her sister was being hunted by someone from their past. Someone they had once trusted. And if they were hunting Kaina, chances were they would start to hunt Inko and her family. Inko looked down at Izuku, Kaina's son. The little boy who she was given to protect from the world. She wasn't going to let him be hunted too. Over the next year, Inko kept her promise and never mentioned her sister or her pro-hero persona. After seeing the new broadcast and seeing that Lady Nagant had been arrested for killing 2 pro-heroes, Inko understood why Kaina didn't want Izuku to learn the truth. Her sister had been branded as a terrorist and an S-grade villain. If people knew that she was Lady Nagant's sister or Izuku was her biological son, they would view them differently. Inko didn't want to have that on Izuku's consciousness. It would make him question who he truly was. With Hisashi's connections, it was easy to erase Inko's connection to her sister. Her having Hisashi's last name and Izuku being born under the Midoriya name streamlined everything. But that was never going to be the easy part. Izuku was a smart kid, and when he realized how different his quirk was from Inko and Hisahi's quirk, he would begin to ask questions. At first, it was easy to answer Izuku's question about where Aunt Kaina was and why she wasn't visiting anymore. A simple lie of how she was too busy to visit was enough to satisfy Izuku's curiosity. But Inko knew that wasn't going to last for very long. She worked every day to mentally prepare herself for the day she had to tell the biggest lie in her life. Inko thought she was ready for that day. But when it happened, she wasn't. It had started out like any other day with Inko waking Izuku up for kindergarten. Izuku was slowly waking up, brushing his purple hair out of his face. After a few minutes, he was awake enough to get out of bed and get dressed. Walking down the hallway, Izuku began scratching his right arm. When Inko noticed, she asked, Is there something wrong with your arm, Izuku? Izuku continued to scratch his arm. It feels sore and itchy. Oh, you just probably slept on it weird. It can happen to anyone. Let's focus on breakfast and getting you to school. Inko said, in a lullaby tone of voice. She used whenever she wanted Izuku to do something without arguing. Despite the constant tingly feeling in his arm, Izuku focused on his and his mother's routine to get him ready for school. After a quick breakfast and brushing of teeth, Inko drove Izuku to kindergarten. Walking him up to the front door, Inko noticed that Izuku was still scratching his arm. Is your arm still sore, honey? Inko said, crouching to be at eye level with her son. Yeah, but it's not as bad as it was before, Izuku said, putting on a cute tough guy face. This caused Inko to laugh and hug Izuku. Well, try not to think about it too much. If it still feels weird after school, we'll take it to the doctor and see what's wrong with it, Inko said. Izuku nodded, then walked into school. Throughout the day, Izuku did his best to ignore how sore and irritated his arm was. Yet the feeling only got stronger and stronger through the day. Until after lunch, when everyone headed outside to play in the yard. At that point, Izuku couldn't withstand the feeling in his arm anymore. Once he was outside, he stepped aside and attacked his arm. Yet the feeling never went away, even after his arm was red. As he continued to scratch his arm, he watched as the other kids kicked a ball around. They were enjoying themselves until Izuku's best friend Katsuki Bakugo got a hold of the ball and accidentally kicked it a little too hard. It bounded out of the playset and ricocheted into a nearby tree. All the kids walked over to the tree and took turns jumping up and trying to knock the ball out of the tree. Maybe we should get one of the teachers to help, a kid suggested as another kid attempted and failed to retrieve the ball. None of them were getting close. Nah, we don't need their help, Bakugo said confidently, as he was the only one that was even getting remotely close to the branch that the ball was resting in, though he was still a good few centimeters away. But none of us can jump high enough to get it, another kid pointed out. Izuku pushed himself off of the building and began walking over, thinking he could help. Bakugo noticed Izuku and smiled, as despite being one of the shorter students, Izuku was the most athletic. Why don't we let Izuku give it a try? He's sure to get it down, and then we won't have to ask the adults for help. Izuku looked up at the tree. He was a good jumper, but even then he didn't think he would be able to reach up that high. I don't know, Kaken. I agree with the others. It would be better to get one of the teachers. Besides, why don't you use your quirk to knock it down? Izuku said, looking at his best friend. Bakugo scoffed and said, Yeah, then I'll get in trouble for using my quirks. I guess you're just afraid that you can't jump that high. Izuku knew that Bakugo was just baiting him, and honestly, he didn't care. To Izuku, it was Bakugo's way of saying that he really thought Izuku would be able to do it. Izuku judged the height he would have to jump again, then said, I guess it won't hurt to try. But if I can't get it, then we should ask one of the teachers to get it for us. All the kids nodded in agreement, while Bakugo just clicked his tongue at how easily Izuku could make people agree with him. Izuku backed up a bit to get a running start, signaling to everyone to give him a clear path. Once everyone had taken a big step away from the tree, then Izuku took off. As he got close to the tree, he pulled his arms back, and then swung them up as he launched himself upwards. As he rose up through the air, he reached his hands up, aiming for the ball. As he began to reach the apex of his jump, it looked like he would be able to get the ball. But as it turned out, he was still a few millimeters too short. As he began to fall, he tried to force his arm to stretch off, to knock the ball out of the tree. Suddenly, his right arm screamed out in pain and steam started to appear around it. Izuku felt his right forearm expand and buggled, increasing in size, while his hand stretched out in length as it became narrow. His hand shot out, knocking the ball from the tree. Together, Izuku and the ball fell to the ground. As Izuku landed, he fell to his knees, holding his right arm tight against his chest. Pain exploded through his arm, just to disappear, only then to reappear. As he held his transformed arm against his chest, the pain began to slowly decrease. At that moment, the principal of the school noticed all the kids standing by the tree. As she walked over, she asked, Is everything all right? The kids looked at Izuku, watching as his dark purple hair began to change. It was no longer a single color. Patches and strips of green were spread through Izuku's hair. Bakugo looked at Principal Nozomi and said, I think Izuku just got his quirk. Being an old friend of Inko from the middle, Principal Aniko Nozomi knew Inko and Kaina. They had both been bridesmaids at Inko and Hisaha's wedding, meaning she was one of the few people Inko told about Izuku's situation. Knowing that it needed to be kept a secret, Principal Nozomi quickly knelt down in front of Izuku and whispered, Midoriya, I need to see your arm. Izuku slowly nodded and revealed his hand to her. While Inko and Kaina always believed Izuku would inherit Kaina's quirk, there was a small chance Izuku inherited the quirk of whoever his father was. If he had, then life for him would have been much simpler, going forever. Yet once Principal Nozomi saw Izuku's right arm, she knew that no one else could see it. Izuku, can you transform it back? She whispered. Izuku shook his head. The feeling in his arm was completely new, and he couldn't control it. Principal Nozomi knew she needed to act fast, so she slipped her suit jacket off and put it over Izuku. Then she looked to Bakugo and said, Can you please inform Mr. Bashira that he'll need to come out? I need to take Midoriya to my office. Bakugo nodded and took off while Principal Nozomi helped Izuku to his feet. She walked him through the yard and inside the building. Quickly walking through the schoolhouse to her office, Principal Nozomi locked the door as she and Izuku were in. She instructed Izuku to sit in one of the chairs as she walked over to her desk and dialed Inko's phone number. Once the line connected, Principal Nozomi said, Hello Inko, I hope you're having a good day. That's good to hear. I'm calling because Izuku's quirk appeared. Sadly, it's Kaina. Nearly a perfect match, even down to the hair changing. No one else had seen his arm, not even the other kids. You came to me because you trusted me. It's okay for now. We're in my office right now. However, there is an issue. He doesn't know how to transform it back. I think it would be best if you got here as soon as possible. I won't be able to hold him in my office all day without some questions being asked. Principal Nozomi was quiet for a second, then said, "Okay, I'll let the front desk know. See you in a few." She ended the phone call and then walked over to Izuku. She crouched down and looked Izuku in the eye, then said, "Your mom is going to be here in a few minutes, okay? How are you feeling?" Izuku suddenly smirked for some reason, then held out his left hand and said, "I know how my arm was so itchy." He opened his left hand, and inside his palm was a small glass marble. This got inside. Principal Nozomi looked at the marble extremely confused. A question that won't be answered until Inko arrived. Luckily, it was in a timely manner. Her arrival was announced when a knock came on the door. Principal Nozomi walked over and opened the door. She hustled Inko inside, then closed and locked the door. Principal Nozomi quickly explained how Izuku was trying to get a ball out of a tree. With that information, Inko knelt in front of her son, and with a smile said, "Izuku, I'm going to need to take a look at your arm. Can you show it to me?" Izuku slowly nodded and extended his right arm from within the jacket. Inko was surprised to see Izuku's arm. Then she looked at her friend. Principal Nozomi had said that it was almost a perfect match, but Izuku's arm looked nothing like Kaina's. While Kaina's rifle extended out of her elbow, contorting her lower arm against her shoulder. An aspect of her sister's quirk Inko honestly found disgusting. Yet instead of that, Izuku's entire forearm had transformed into the rifle. His forearm had transformed into the stock and main body of a long-range rifle, while his entire hand had stretched and narrowed into the barrel. It looked like a streamlined version of Kaina's quirk, meaning it had evolved and was more powerful. But now was not the time for testing Izuku's quirk. Would be fine if I took Izuku home for the rest of the day, Inko asked, looking over at her old friend. Principal Nozomi nodded and said, "It's standard practice for a kid to go home early when their quirk first comes in. And between you and me, if you need the rest of the week, take it." Inko nodded, then looked back at her son. She could help him learn his quirk later. For right now, he needed to transform his arm back. Having trained with Kaina with the HPSC, Inko and her sister learned a lot about each other's quirks. Kaina has talked about how it was hard to keep her quirk from forming when she was stressed. For something like this to happen must have been really stressful for Izuku. Using the only method Inko and Kaina used to calm each other down, Inko gently pressed her index finger against Izuku's chest and said, "Izuku, I want you to close your eyes and breathe slowly as you listen to my voice." Izuku nodded and closed his eyes. Emotion starts in the heart, the core of a person's soul. It flows through the lungs and swells with power. Inko traced her finger down to Izuku's midsection. Then it flows through veins and moves the body. Inko brought her finger back up Izuku's chest and towards his shoulder. It goes from a person's feet to the end of the hand. Inko's finger slowly went to Izuku's shoulder, then down his arm. As Inko's finger slowly approached Izuku's elbow, steam began to appear around Izuku's lower arm. His arm slowly transformed back into a normal arm, as Inko's finger traveled down, ending by slipping off of Izuku's middle finger. Izuku took a deep breath and felt his entire body relax. "Everything is going to be okay, sweetie," Inko said, wrapping Izuku in a tight hug. They continued to hug each other for a few minutes. After they were done, Inko gave her friend her jacket back and thanked her. Inko walked Izuku out to the car, and together they went home. At home, Inko made Izuku a small snack of rice, then they sat down at the kitchen table. As Izuku slowly ate his rice, he looked at his mother and asked, "Why weren't others allowed to see my quirk? Is there something wrong with it?" Inko wanted to kick herself for her luck. Of course, Izuku would ask the question that got to the heart of the issue. Inko had to think of something quickly, then her eyes fell on Izuku's All Might shirt. A lie that would be believed and easy to remember formed in her mind. "Izuku, you know how the world is protected by All Might?" Inko began, and Izuku nodded his head. Well, it wasn't always like that. Bad people were hidden in the world's shadows, and they craved power. Imagine if someone bad got a hold of All Might when he was young and taught him to hate the world. Izuku shook his head and said, No, I want to." Inko panicked and hugged Izuku. "It's okay, the world isn't like that, but I worry about you a lot. Your father and I have always known you would have a powerful quirk, but you're gonna have to learn how to control it, to use it to protect others. But until then, it's best not everyone knew about your quirk. Can you do that for me?" Inko asked, holding back a grimace. She knew that probably wasn't the best way to explain everything, but she couldn't take back anything she said. This was the lie she was going to have to live with for her life. Izuku thought about it for a second. The world was filled with powerful quirks, heroes that used them to protect others. What would happen if one of those heroes was raised to be a villain? How different would the world be? If he had a powerful and amazing quirk, then he needed to choose the path of hero. But there was one thing he wanted to do. Can I at least show it to Kaken? Inko had to stop herself from bursting out laughing. Of all the things Izuku was going to say, asking to share his quirk with his best friends should have been the first thing she expected to hear. She gave a light chuckle, then rubbed Izuku's hair. How about you learn how to control your quirk before you show it Katsuki, okay? Izuku nodded with an understanding of his mother's words. Izuku spent the rest of the day playing in his room, while Inko figured out how to test her son on how to use his quirk, without making her seem too knowledgeable. It began with taking Aniko's offer to take the rest of the week off. The next day Inko began teaching Izuku to control his quirk. It started with Izuku learning just what his quirk was. Inko explained to him that his quirk allowed him to transform his right arm into a long-range rifle with the ability to fire a bullet. Inko worked with Izuku to learn how to control his quirk's transformation and only be active when he wanted it to. Something Izuku picked up unnaturally quickly and had a good handle on by the time Inko served lunch. Inko spent the afternoon subtly giving clues that Izuku was supposed to use his dual-colored hair to weave bullets to use. By the time dinner rolled around, Inko was about to spell everything out for her son. But as he sat down, he brushed some hair out of his face. He commented how his hair somehow weaved in on itself. It took Izuku a bit more for him to figure out how to weave his hair into a bullet. He needed to twirl it around his finger a couple of times. Once he figured it out, he slipped the bullet through the small opening that was on the side of his forearm. Izuku felt the bullet slip into place, and he excitedly jumped out of his chair and pointed his arm at the wall. Without much of a warning, Izuku flexed his arm, and a gunshot rang through the house. "Izuku!" Inko screamed as she reached out and grabbed the speeding bullet with her quirk. The bullet glowed green as it slowed down, then stopped in midair. The next moment it flew straight into Inko's outstretched hand. As the bullet landed in her hand, Inko had to catch her breath. That was a use of her quirk she hadn't used in a long time. She flashed a stern look at Izuku, then in a calm voice said, "All right, rule number 1. No firing your quirk inside." "Sorry, Mom," Izuku said, transforming his arm back into its normal form. Inko sighed as she walked over to hug Izuku and say, "It's okay, honey. When I first figured out my quirk, I wanted to see what I could do with it. I accidentally pulled a hot piece of metal into my hand. Let's just be careful of how we use our quirks." Izuku nodded as he hugged his mother back. Inko and Izuku spent the evening resting from working on Izuku's quirk. Once the sun went down together, Izuku went to bed, while Inko went looking through her closet for a vanilla folder. Once she found what she was looking for, she pulled out a vanilla folder that had Project Velocity stamped on the front. Inko walked back to the kitchen table and sat down. She put the vanilla folder on the table and then opened it. Inside were summaries of the different training she and Kaina did as teenagers. She then came across a photo of them trying out their new hero suits, testing to see if they liked them. Lady Nagant was written over Kaina's photo, while Summoner was written over Inko's. But that wasn't what Inko was looking for. Moving to the back of the folder, Inko located a business card of her and Kaina's old HPSC handler. Inko knew she could teach Izuku how to use his quirk, but that was about it. For the skills for Izuku to effectively use his quirk, she was going to need some extra help about that. Depending on what point you looked at Fumiko Maro's career, you could easily call it a complete success or an utter failure. When he first joined the Hero Public Safety Public Commission, right out of high school, he was looking for a job to help through college. It was a low-end job, simple 9 to 5 that let Maro live a bit in luxury. But he didn't feel like he was making a difference, and that was part of the reason why he wanted to further his education. At first, he kept his head down at his job and did what he needed to do. But as he got further and further in college and worked more and more under the commission, he began to notice a gap in the skills of the average pro heroes and the skills that were needed to take down the average villain. Any villain that presented an actual threat to Japan's national security, only the top 12 or so pro heroes were deemed capable of handling it. Even that was year to year based on which pro heroes were popular at the time. Seeing this problem and wanting to get ahead of Maro, he began constructing a program whose purpose was to find young talented kids with powerful quirks and accelerate their training to become pro heroes, so by the time they entered high school, they were on the level of rookie pro heroes. Then throughout their career, these heroes would be able to handle any kind of situation they came across. Yet creating Project Velocity on paper and getting it to the hands of the HPSC president was another story. When Maro first created the program, he was still a 9-5 employee and didn't have much sway in anything, so he had little hope of getting the program greenlit. But as Maro worked through college and earned his master's in criminal behavior, he used his knowledge and charisma to help his co-worker. With all his promotions and his position keeping him and his wife in Mustafa, Maro began to lose hope in his program. So in one last attempt, Maro decided to try and send a 1,000-page memo to the president of the HPSC. Yet he didn't expect any response, so he shelved Project Velocity for years, saving the only other digital copy to a flash drive on his keychain. And that's where Project Velocity stayed, until he received words the HPSC president walked to talk to him. Maro was flown into Tokyo and given 30 minutes to give a presentation about Project Velocity. Those 30 minutes were the most stressful for Maro. But after giving his closing remarks, Maro was surprised the HPSC president began to tap his pen against his desk. More so when the HPSC president put down his pen and then rolled it away. Maro was ready to speak when the HPSC president stood up and walked away from his desk. He walked up to the floor-to-ceiling window behind his desk and looked over the city. "Tell Maro, how long have you been working for the commission?" "Sir?" Maro asked. "It's a simple question. You were able to write a 1,000-page memo abbreviating your program. You could have written it longer, but you knew the longer the memo, the less someone was going to read it. So I think you should be able to answer my question. How long have you been working for the commission?" The HPSC president asked again. "Since I graduated high school, sir. I'm coming up on the 11-year mark." Maro said as his eyes jumped down the unsigned document that the HPSC president had left behind. "Even early on you noticed discrepancies on what makes someone a pro-hero," the HPSC said as he put a hand on the window and leaned on it as he looked over Tokyo. "The most preposterous city in Japan and one of the most attacked by villains." "Sir?" Maro asked. "I've been in my position for nearly 40 years, and I've never met someone that saw the same problem as I do. In your memo, you're brought up that for most pro-heroes, it takes time for them to stop a villain, whether it's a hostage situation or a burglary." "Yes, sir. It took a bit of factoring since every situation is unique in itself." Maro said he shifted his weight awkwardly. "Do you still hold to the belief you wrote for Project Velocity?" the HPSC president suddenly questioned, catching Maro off guard. "I might have been a little strong in my wording, but yes," Maro said as he began to tap his right hand against his leg. Had he been closed in because the HPSC president thought that he was an anti-hero? On page 379, you brought up the average cost for property damage, victim comp, and taxpayer dollars used to fix a situation after a pro-hero messes up. You were a bit off in your calculation, but you were using information that wasn't the whole truth. But you were right with what you had," the HPSC president said, causing Maro to be taken back. The president of the HPSC had read his memo. "You see, you were using the tuition fees that were from more public hero high schools. But private high schools such as UA or Shiksu, their yearly tuition fee can be upwards to 10 million yen. Remind me what you come up with is the average property damage paid yearly for most pro-heroes." It was 2.5 million yen at the high end, sir," Maro said. The HPSC president tapped his knuckles against the window and said, "Meaning within just 4 years a pro-hero can cause enough property damage that the cost would have covered sending them to UA for one." The HPSC president tapped his knuckles against the window once more, then turned to face Maro. "I'll be frank with you, Maro. The quality of heroes has fallen over the years. In the beginning, it was people fighting for Quirk's rights, to protect their families and nation. Nowadays most become heroes for fame and fortune. And it shows. Every year the commission is having to pay more and more for property damage. And 7 out of 10 times property damage is caused by pro-heroes. And the 3 it's because the villain was able to run away. Just yesterday one of those instant villains was able to run around because the heroes weren't up to the task. They didn't have the skill. You see, the new generation of pro-heroes, they don't think they want to be better, faster, stronger, more popular. They only care about their next paycheck. So when they're faced with a challenge that's beyond their level, they think they can still win. But then they make mistakes. And who has to pay for it? Certainly not the pro-heroes. They've only painted in a good light because they stopped the villain. Definitely not the hero school, the ones that failed in training and preparing new hero students for the jobs. No, it's the commission, because it was formed to oversee pro-heroes. We have to pay for their failure, for their unpreparedness. Until the point I'm forced to play my hand and demand new training for new heroes. Also they're better prepared. Yet I'm told to back off. That's not my position or my job to oversee that part of the heroes. Sir, Maro said as the HPSC president was staring at him so hard his very soul was starting to shake. The HPSC president took a breath and said, I'm tired of being handed faulty heroes, having to pay for everyone's mistakes. And when I try to fix the problem, I'm barred. I'm done with political and democratic processes. I'm ready to have the issue fixed and willing to use underhanded means to do so. So we're going to attack the newer generations where they're vulnerable. I'm not following, sir, Maro said. Competition. New pro heroes all want to be the most popular. It makes their paycheck bigger. And when quality drops at the top, it does so at bottom even more. So Maro, I want you to train the best damn hero this world has ever seen. They'll be the most skilled, and when they become more popular, others will have to be better. They'll realize they have to train to be the best, not the most flashy or most charismatic, but the strongest and most skilled. They'll be able to handle any kind of villain that decides to stir up trouble. Sir, Project Velocity is greenlit, Maro said to make sure of what he was hearing. Yes, I signed off before you arrived. But understand, Maro, UA and other schools can't learn what your program is, or they will retaliate. They'll claim we're undermining the system, just because we're doing their job better than them. Project Velocity won't be off the books, but it will be so deep underground that no one you don't tell will ever learn about it. And this plan of ours will take time, but I'll be keeping an eye on everything. Both of our careers could be put on the line with this, so I expect some kind of result by the end of the year. Am I understood? Yes, sir. Maro was ecstatic. His life dream was coming true, and he had the chance to train a pro hero. A hero that would show the world what the #1 hero looked like. Once the meeting was over, Maro was given access to an old commission building that was used mainly for storage. He would have preferred the state-of-the-art faculty, but as the program was a secret, Maro was happy for any help. Maro spent the weekend looking over the building, and it did have potential. So after calling in a few favors and working late at night, the building was slowly emptied and cleaned. Once that was all done, Maro had to find things to fill the place. The first and most obvious items were the training machine and turning a floor into a studio to train martial arts. One floor was dedicated to the filing and administration work. Then the building was sectioned off for more specialized training, such as different environments that pro heroes would come across or rooms to train specific types of quirks. Then came getting workers for the program. Maro was able to hire some of his co-workers who had climbed the job ladder as well, while hiring some fresh minds to the commission. And while the HPSC president stayed out of the program for the most part, remaining a silent observer, he didn't impress some few employees that Maro was more than happy to accept as a show of good faith. Then came the trainers. Those ranks were mainly filled with older HPSC employees who had once been heroes themselves or had trained in some form of martial arts their entire lives. Then the final brick to be laid was finding someone who had potential. A kid who had a powerful quirk and a baseline of skills to work on, but more than anything else, a kid had a deeply rooted want to become a pro hero. And while Maro wasn't about to find a kid, he came across a pair of sisters that were closely knit together and could grow to become a pro hero duo. The older one could form a powerful rifle out of her elbow, and the younger sister had a weak form of telekinesis. When their files came across Maro's desk, at first he thought he had been given them accidentally. Though out of curiosity he looked them over and became interested in the older sister. She could become one of the deadliest sharpshooters in the world, able to take out a villain from far away. But then there is the younger sister, her quirk only allowing her to attract small objects to her. Maybe useful to a rescue hero if the object were heavier. Maro kept the file in thought for a week, and once he found time he met with the older sister. The older sister was excited, to say the least. She wanted to protect the little guy in her own words. But when Maro explains that her younger sister would be barred, the older sister threatens to close the door. At the moment Maro didn't think he should, but as Project Velocity needed to show results soon, he allowed the younger sister to join in the training. It didn't take long for Maro to become grateful he took the deal. Within months of training, the pairs of sisters were progressing faster than expected. And while it was a bit lost on him why, his wife happily provided scientific reasoning behind it. She explained they were sisters. That much was obviously. What wasn't so clear was what that meant. Maro's wife explained that they were close to each other in every aspect, and wanted to see each other become the best version of themselves. That's why they trained so heavily, because they wanted each to be the best they could be. And all this pushing made the sisters better every day, until, by the time the young sister was a senior in high school, and the older sister only had 3 years as a pro hero under her belt, they were on the level of many top pro heroes. One perfected long-range encounters, while the other became the nation's top closed-quarters fighter. And together there was no challenger, no opponent they couldn't fight against and win. Yet not everything can last forever. Though the younger sister happily trained alongside her sister, Maro noticed she didn't have the same drive to become a pro hero as her older sister. So after graduating high school, the young sister met a charming man, and it didn't take long before they were announcing they were getting married, and she would be leaving the life of a hero. Maro would admit the wedding was beautiful, and he was happy for the young sister. But the HPSC wasn't too happy about losing a valuable asset. Luckily for Maro, the older sister stepped up in her career and became a well-known hero. Her success in the billboard and media proved Project Velocity was a success. The media was covering everything they could about her. Then the older just had to go and ruin everything by killing the head of the HPSC. When Maro received the call that Lady Nagant had killed the president of the HPSC, he knew he had to protect his program at any cost. He worked tirelessly the following week, getting everything ready for anything that could be thrown at him. Then when the time came, he stood in front of the board of the HPSC. The worth of Project Velocity was brought into question, and whether the success achieved was worth the end results. Maro fought hard to keep the program alive and under his command. It was a long 7 months, and in the end, Project Velocity was kept alive. But Maro had to hand control over to a council that was formed to oversee the program. While many wanted to see Maro barred from the commission, a deal was made that Maro would be kept on the program as an acting supervisor, if and only if he was able to find a suitable replacement for Lady Nagant by the year's end. Luckily, fate was in Maro's favor, and only 6 months later, he was about to find a kid that was about to save over 50 people. With his career riding on the line, Maro began to immediately train the kid and his quirk. Everything about the kid's progress was documented, and when the evaluations came, the kid was on track to become the perfect replacement for Lady Nagant. Takami had even less skill coming into the program, but he was making more than enough headway to keep Project Velocity alive. Yet Maro knew how easily success could become undermined, so he made sure to keep Takami on pace. At Takami's year test, he blew all of his records out of the water. So much so that after Maro thanked his superiors, he told a member of his team to buy Takami a gift to keep him in high spirits. Maro then drove home to celebrate his newfound success alone, as his wife was at a conference in Tokyo. As soon as he got home, ordered his favorite takeout, and as he waited for the food to arrive, he searched his drink rack and found a bottle of Kurosawa Samurai 110. Returning to his dining room, just as the food arrived, Maro was about to sit down and enjoy the success of his life's work. Or he planned to, if it was not for his phone ringing. Groaning, he stood up from the table and walked up to his couch from his suit jacket. Maybe it was his wife calling, and Maro would be more than happy to talk to her after the long day he had. Yet after fishing his phone out, Maro saw that it was an unknown number. Damn it, Henkido, this better not be you. That's your 7th phone in the past 4 months. Maro said, because who else would have his phone but their contact not be saved? He walked back to the table and then answered the phone. What is it, Henkido? Good to hear that you haven't fired Henkido yet. A voice came through. A voice that was the start of his downfall. A voice that he honestly didn't think he would hear ever again, nor did he want to. Hold on, if I'm going to talk with you, then I'm going to need a drink first, Maro said as he put the phone on the table and he popped the cork on his drink. After pouring a small bit of alcohol and drinking it, Maro looked back at the phone. All right, who is this? I thought that's what the drink was for. Maro, sir, Inko said, her voice taking a light-hearted tone. She probably didn't like making this phone call any more than Maro liked getting it. They had gone on their separate paths a long time ago. Inko Midoriya, as I live and breathe. What could possibly possess you to call me after what you and your sister did to Project Velocity? Maro said as he poured himself another glass. It was a few moments before Inko spoke again. When she did, it was soft and controlled. Sir, I did not call you to air out any grievance. But I know my sister, and I didn't always show our appreciation for what you did for us. Me leaving the program at such a crucial time was wrong to do, and what my sister did by killing those other heroes. Everything you did for us, getting us out of that situation, training us to be heroes. I'm sorry everything ended the way it did. Maro shook his head as he had to remember the lie the HPSC had created for the media. Maro and his team had worked hard and fast to cover that mess up. Yet from the way Inko spoke, she knew that wasn't the truth. Maro found that strange, but if she knew the truth, then why would be calling? She would never trust the HPSC again if she knew the truth. Well, thank you for that. So what do I owe the pleasure of your call? Maro asked, his curiosity piqued by this. He needed to know if Inko knew the truth behind that day. If she knew, then no matter how well Takami did on his test, if Inko released that information, Maro could end up in Tartarus alongside Kana. Sir, the day my sister got arrested, she called me. Maro began to panic as there had been no information of Lady Nagant making a call as the HPSC chased her down. Perhaps Inko knew the truth. I was the last one she talked to before she was captured. Sir, the way she spoke, it sounded like she was being framed for killing those pro-heroes. In her final words to me, she told me that we trusted the wrong person, and now I believe that same person might try to hunt me and my family down. I thought we had trained you to protect yourself in this situation, and your husband is in America right now, Maro said, still trying to figure out if Inko knew the truth. It was clear she didn't believe the story told to the media, but she didn't know the actual story. Kana hadn't revealed any of that information, so perhaps Project Velocity wasn't in danger and Maro could salvage Inko's potential. Maro heard Inko take a deep breath and then say, Sir, Kana had a son. Maro almost choked on his own tongue. Kana had a child, yet she was never married, and how did she hide it from the media, let alone Maro and his team? She did her best to hide it from everyone, including the HPSC. In the end, knowing her job won't allow her to be a proper mom, she gave her son to Hisashi and me to raise. He gained his quirk today, and honestly, I don't know how to train him, to teach him how to use my sister's quirk without bringing up our past. I can't do that. I need help, and you and Project Velocity are the only people I know that can do so. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was wanting to make up for past mistakes, to prove that the first trainees of Project Velocity were not such a big failure as the HPSC Council thought they were. Maro absorbed all this new information. Inko didn't know the truth, and because of that, she still trusted Project Velocity. Kana had a son who had the same quirk as her, meaning it would just be if not more powerful. If Maro could train this kid to be a hero, then along with Takami, the HPSC would have 2 well-trained heroes on their payroll. Well, Mrs. Midoriya, it sounds like your family has many secrets it's kept. But your position sounds troublesome. And though there has been rough terrain between us in the past, what kind of servant would I be to this nation if I turned you and your son away? Maro said, pouring a third drink. He grabbed it as he stood up from the table and began to pace the room. Thank you, Maro, sir, Inko said. I'll inform the HPSC Council of our conversation, and inform you when a time has been set apart for you and, Maro said as he swirled the alcohol in the glass. Izuku Midoriya, Inko said. Izuku to come into the faculty. Oh, and Mrs. Midoriya, will there be any baggage this time? Maro said as he remembered Kina's demeanor that despite Inko's quirk not becoming powerful, Kina would only train in Project Velocity if her sister could join her. It had turned out to be fruitful, but it was still a risk and a gamble nevertheless, and Maro didn't think his luck would stay positive much longer. To keep Izuku from learning of his past, he has not been informed of Kina being his mother. He has always been registered as a Midoriya, and I would like to keep it that way. That is all I ask for. Inko pleaded. She had promised Kina that her son would never learn the truth, and Izuku at the moment was a fragile kid. If he learned their family's dark secret, there was no telling how it would destroy him. I understand. Your sister might have been framed for her misdoing. But to save your son from the public eye, I will grant that request. No one will be informed of your son's actual parents. Maro said as he raised his drink as if giving a toast. Take Me had kept the program alive, but it was going to be Izuku who showed the nation of Japan the success of Project Velocity. Good night, Maro, and thank you, Inko said. Good night, Mrs. Midoriya. Maro said, then ended the call as he downed the rest of his drink. The day was glorious, but it was at night when true victory was achieved. Maro knew he couldn't let his opportunity waste away, so he needed to work fast. Switching over to contacts, Maro pulled up Henkito's number and called it. After the third ring, the call connected and Henkito opened with, Good evening, sir. What do you need? Henkito, how would you feel about working some overtime? Maro asked as he focused on getting everything ready. The timing of this was critical. He needed everything ready for when he stood in front of the HPSC Council. They would find out about his team training Izuku, and if they feared the past repeating, then Maro would most certainly be kicked from the program. And then control would go to someone else, something Maro couldn't let happen. The program was his dream, his idea. He wouldn't let someone else have the glory of it. On what, sir? Henkito asked. Making Project Velocity what it was always meant to be, Maro said, with the plan of no longer allowing his career to be a laughing stock. The next day and over the coming week, Maro worked with his team to get ready for Inko and Izuku's visit to their training faculty. Maro was vague on the details of the purpose of the visit, only telling a select few of those who needed to know. He wanted to give himself as much time as possible to get everything squared away before the council caught wind of everything. Maro searched through the files, digital and physical, until he found the files pertaining to the Tsunami's sister. He looked over the file cabinet worth of information, which contained training regimens for weights, karate, judo, and buketsu, along with test results and a food plan to build up stamina and strength. Every day Maro went home exhausted, but more proud than ever. As each day, he could see his vision of Project Velocity becoming more and more of a reality. At the end of the week, everything was ready, so Maro called Inko on a secure line and informed her. They quickly set up a day for Inko to bring Izuku in and run some tests on his quirks. In the end, they decided on next Saturday after lunch, and Inko ended the phone call by thanking her old friend, and Maro remarked he was happy to be of service again. Even with everything squared away, Maro didn't slow down. He doubled and triple-checked everything. He planned on only having a small team, himself and 4 others, when Izuku arrived. This meeting was just as secret as Project Velocity was at the beginning. A small team help a kid with a powerful quirk become a hero. In the beginning, and in the end, that's what the program was built to do. On the day of the meeting, Inko worked from a long and resting sleep. Her worry had stayed constant throughout the week. Everything she saw Izuku, she couldn't help but think of the situation of her sister. Inko was reminded of how she had seen or heard from her sister for some time. But that was the price of keeping herself and Izuku safe. And while Inko didn't know how Kaina's situation was in Tartarus, Inko was sure her sister was thinking the same. As Inko got out of bed and walked over to the window to open, the morning sunlight touched her face, and she felt relaxed. Kaina always said she enjoyed looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars. But to Inko, nothing could ever beat the sight of a beautiful sunrise. Inko looked at the rising sun and hoped that after a day her worry would become tempting. Turning away from the window, Inko headed downstairs and started making breakfast. As she worked in the kitchen, she heard the sounds of Izuku waking up, and a few minutes later, he walked into the kitchen. He yawned as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and sat down at the table. "Izuku, honey, we're going to meet up with some of Mom's old friends this afternoon. Is that all right with you?" Inko asked as she cracked a few eggs over a frying pan. She had decided to go with American-style scrambled eggs and toast. Let the egg cook. Inko pulled up a cabinet and grabbed the loaf of bread. At the safe timing, using her quirk to plug the toast, which she slipped the beard into and pulled it down. "But Kaken and I made plans to play with each other this afternoon. You said I couldn't show him my quirk until I had some control over it." "You said last night that I had control," Izuku said in a sad tone. He had worked so hard to learn how to control his quirk. He wanted so badly to show it to his best friends. They always talked about becoming the best pro heroes, and with their quirk, they could easily do so. Inko made the mistake of looking over at Izuku and saw his big pleading puppy eyes. Despite all her training to be a hero, her ability to either take down a villain or talk them out of something, with her ability to end hostage situations, disarm a bomb, and go toe-to-toe with the best pro heroes, Inko barely lasted a few seconds looking at Izuku before she broke. Kaina and Hisashi always said she had a too soft spot for kids. "Okay, Katsuki can come along. I'm sure they'll love meeting him too," Inko said in a defeated tone as she turned back to making breakfast. She could hear Izuku doing a small celebration at winning the conversation. Inko couldn't believe how much she was wrapped around Izuku's little fingers, but she had promised her sister to be a loving mother. Once breakfast was made and eaten, Inko disappeared into her room to make sure everything was ready for the afternoon. While she did this, Izuku played in the front room by himself, waiting for his friend to come over. Around lunchtime, a knock came on the front door, and Izuku giddily ran to and opened it. On the other side of the door was Izuku's best friend, Katsuki Bakugo. He was wearing a black shirt with a skull on it and tan pants. As Izuku opened up the door, Bakugo had his hands in his pocket, as he looked at Izuku with an unimpressed face. "Mom said you sounded pretty enthusiastic last night. So what's this thing you wanted to show me?" Bakugo said as he walked into the house. Izuku closed the door and fell into step with his friends. "My quirk," Izuku said, his voice starting to get fast. As he led his best friend to the dining room, a bounce appeared in his step. He had worked so hard to gain control over his quirk, and it was so cool to him. "That weird thing your arm did at school a week ago. I think I was the only one that saw that. I was going to say something, but the principal's action made it obvious that no one was supposed to see it," Bakugo said as he and Izuku sat at the table. 2 sandwiches were waiting for them, making Izuku look into the kitchen to see his mother making herself one. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Since when had she been in the kitchen? So what's your quirk so mysterious? I bet it is not even cool, not like mine. Bakugo held a hand up and lit off a small explosion. Katsuki, no quirks in the house, Inko said from the kitchen. The second explosion quickly died in Bakugo's hand as a whiff of smoke appeared, then he had to wave out of his face. He then turned to Izuku and gave a confused look. My quirks can be a bit destructive, yours too. So mom made the rule of no quirks in the house. To stop accidents from happening too often, Izuku explained as he thought back to when he first used his quirk in the house. Bakugo shrugged as he lowered his hand and went back to his sandwich. If you can't your quirk, then how are you going to show me? Izuku laughed as a mischievous grin that looked as if he had gotten away stealing a cookie from the jar appeared on his face. There's a difference between showing and using. Let's have lunch first. This caused Bakugo to laugh, and they both quickly finished their lunch. Once their meal was eaten, and they had put their plate in the sink, Izuku led Bakugo into the living room. Walking back into the living room, Izuku directed Bakugo to sit on the couch, while he positioned himself on the floor between the couch and the ottoman. Izuku laid his arm across the ottoman and took a deep breath. Flexing his hand and forearm, Izuku felt a small tingly feeling appear as steam formed around his arm. He felt his forearm and hand change, expanding as he activated his quirk. A few seconds later, Izuku's shot forearm, while hand and fingers narrowed and curled into a barrel. Resting on the ottoman was now a purple and green long-range rifle, and as Bakugo's mind recognized the change, he jumped a bit in his seat. As Bakugo settled down and lowered himself back down to the couch, he leaned forward to get a better look. Izuku's arm looked like a mixture between flesh and metal, and at the point of transformation, Izuku's veins were purple until they disappeared into his upper arm. What is it? Bakugo asked as neither of them had seen a gun before. They were still only 5 years old, and since quirk had been inherited by 80% of the world's population, people had stopped carrying small firearms for personal protection. And while police carried around pistols, neither of the young boys had seen a gun that looked like Izuku's arm. My mom said it was a rifle. And get this, I can twirl my hair and weave them into bullets, Izuku said as he began to use his left hand to twirl a bit of his hair. After a few seconds, the hair solidified into a bullet that Izuku used to make a show out of loading the bullet. I haven't had a chance to get much practice. It is not as easy to hide as your quirk. Izuku looked at Bakugo and noticed his best friend had a weird look on his face. Izuku looked back at his arm, then back at his friends. Arm, friend, arm, friend. What? Izuku asked as Bakugo stared intently back at Izuku's arm. Midoriya, look at your arm, Bakugo finally said. That just confused Izuku further. Wasn't the whole point of this to show off his quirk? Maybe Bakugo found it weird to look at, or he found it cool. But then again, that described most of the quirks that were heteromorphic. Either really cool or really weird. But Izuku couldn't tell which way Bakugo was leaning. I am, Izuku said in a sarcastic tone. No, I don't mean your right arm. Cool, by the way. I mean your left arm. You have a mark that wasn't there a few seconds ago, and Aunt Inko isn't going to let you get a tattoo, Bakugo said, lowering his voice to a whisper as he slid off the couch. He grabbed Izuku's left arm and rotated it so the inner side of his biceps was revealed. Izuku looked at his left bicep, confused about what his friend was trying to point out, and then he noticed it. It was small, easily mistakable as a Sharpie mess or old carnival tattoo, but on Izuku's left bicep was a purple marking in the shape of a bullet. And Izuku was sure it wasn't there a few moments ago. What do you think it's for? Izuku said as he poked it. It didn't feel sore like a new tattoo should be, nor did it rub off like a temporary tattoo would have. Izuku then inspected the rest of his left arm to see if there were any other markings, but he didn't find any. I don't know, but it wasn't there earlier, Bakugo said. At that moment, Inko came into the living room and looked between the boys. All right, boys, it's time to head out, Inko said. She had just gotten off a call with Mitsuki where they talked about Izuku joining Project Velocity. Mitsuki had joked about how Katsuki should join the program, if nothing else to learn some manners. Inko ended the call by calling Mitsuki buff, saying that Katsuki was welcome to join Izuku in training. Bakugo looked between Izuku and Inko. Where are we going? To meet some of Mom's old friends, Izuku said, hopping off the ground, and Bakugo followed him out of curiosity. Inko helped the boys load up in the car and then got in herself. After backing out of the driveway, Inko directed the car to the building where Project Velocity was stationed. On the drive there, Inko thought back to the training she and Kaina went through. In the beginning, it was tiresome. They trained more than just their quirks. Their minds and bodies were put through the ringers too. Each day they were exhausted, and they often fell asleep on their way home. Through that training, Inko became a strong woman. Yet the life of a hero was something she never wanted. When she met Hisashi, she felt marrying him was the only way out of becoming a pro hero like her sister. But now she needed to protect her family from whoever hunted her sister. Izuku needed the same training to learn how to use his quirk and how to protect himself. Within the hour, they arrived at Project Velocity. Inko pulled the car into a parking spot and got out, as Izuku and Bakugo were right behind her. Izuku looked up at the building and thought it looked like it belonged to a corporate business. He looked at Inko and said, "Mom, I thought we were going to meet some of your old friends." The Midoriya family had never really been that wealthy, nor had they been associated with upper-class workers. Hisashi was working in America and sent money home, but his pay barely covered the house and his apartment. The closest was the Bakugo family and Masaru's work in the fashion business, but they didn't live a wealthy lifestyle, nor did Mitsuki Bakugo act like a rich woman. However, in Inko's mind, she definitely pushed the envelope. "We are," Inko said as she walked up the stairs and opened one of the doors. She then turned around and gestured for the boys to follow her. Izuku and Bakugo looked at each other, grins appearing on their faces as they took off after Inko. She led the duo to an elevator, and once inside pressed the button for the 5th floor. As the trio rode the elevator, Izuku looked at Inko and asked, "Mom, who are we exactly going to meet?" His mother never mentioned having friends who worked in a building like this. Inko sighed, then looked down at the ground. "Zuzu, do you remember that conversation we had when you first got your quirk?" Izuku gave a small nod. "Your mother knows some people that specialize in training young kids with powerful quirks, such as yours and Katsuki's. They help kids like you learn how to use their quirks and become heroes." From that, Izuku got a big smile, while Bakugo got a feral one. Now that they knew what was happening, neither of them could wait to show off their quirks and what they could do with it. Yet it seemed to take forever before the elevator arrived on the 5th floor and opened. Once the door opened, they were met with an amazing sight. A kid, only a few years older than Izuku and Bakugo, with bright red wings, was flying around the floor. As he flew around, feathers from his wings shot out and hit targets of varying sizes. These targets were placed all around the floor, and the kid hadn't missed a single one. Izuku and Bakugo watched as the kid hit the last target with 3 feathers and then landed right next to a table. As the kid looked at the adults, all the feathers that had been shot into the targets dislodged themselves and returned to the red wings on the kid's back. Standing at the table were Fumiko, Maro, and 4 members of his team. Maro looked up from a monitor screen and said to the kid, "Well done, Takami, you beat your previous record by 3.5 seconds. Keep up that pace, and you'll be on the level of a pro hero by the time you're a teenager." The kid nodded as pulled a blindfold down from his eyes. Izuku hadn't noticed the blindfold as the kid was flying around, making the kid's skill even more impressive. The red-winged kids looked at the different targets. He then turned back to Maro and said, "I thought the targets were supposed to be in different places. A lot of them felt like they hadn't moved." "They were." Maro paused and then looked over the targets. A lot of them seemed to be in the same location as last time. He then turned to his workers and sighed. This caused the woman to flicker and defend herself with, "I haven't gotten much sleep because of your little side project, so sue me." Maro sighed again as he folded his arm and brought a hand up to pinch the bridge of his nose. She was a good worker, one of the best for the program, but all the work Maro had to put in to cover her forgetful behavior. Some days were harder than others. "Henkito, what am I going to do with you?" The employee, now identified as Henkito, looked ready to defend herself, but then noticed Inko and the 2 boys. The gears of her mind were visible as she took a few moments to recognize Inko. Once she did, she got a big smile and yelled, "Inko, is that you?" before running over and hugging Inko. Inko had to brace as Henkito was a forgetful person, and with her strength enhancement quirk, a hug from Henkito could break a few ribs. Luckily, Henkito didn't squeeze too hard and Inko was able to still breathe. Inko hugged Henkito back and asked, "How's life been since I last saw you last?" Henkito didn't answer, but just continued to smile until Maro and the other present members of Project Velocity came over. After Henkito released her, Inko bowed to Maro and thanked him again for his assistance. "Mrs. Midoriya, it is good to see you again." Maro then noticed there was more than one kid. One that Inko hadn't mentioned. "Excuse, but I was informed you only had one child. Yet I see 2. One who does not have much of your or your husband's genetics." Inko chuckled a bit then clarified. "This is Katsuki Bakugo. He's the son of one of my friends." I thought you might like to examine his quirk as well as my son's. I promise you won't be disappointed. Bakugo? You mean that hot-headed loud-mouthed friend of yours? Hankido said, then quickly covered her mouth. She looked at Inko as if she had just killed Inko's dog right in front of her. Yet Inko didn't seem too worried, simply waving Hankido's worry away with a hand. I'm sure she's been called worse, and what she doesn't know won't hurt her. Inko could recall that Bakugo's first name for Mitsuki wasn't Mama. It was just straight to old hag. Maro looked over the two boys, knowing it was just better to go along with it, rather than figure out what part Bakugo played in all this. Hello Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo. I'm looking forward to what you will show us today. But first I would like you three to meet Keigo Takami. He's the second wave of Project Velocity trained heroes. If you're accepted into the program, then you'll be spending some time training with him, Maro said, as Takami walked up to the group. Takami looked between Izuku and Bakugo, then bowed and said, It's nice to meet you both. Please call me Keigo. I'm looking forward to training with both of you. Mr. Maro held you in high regard, enough to make his team go without sleep for a week. Takami, I didn't, Maro said, then looked around at the members of his team. Many had small rings under their eyes and their shoulders were hunched over. Only Hankido seemed to be the only one with energy. But that might be just because she forgot how tired she was. All right, head home all of you. I told you to work fast, not work yourself into your graves. I can handle the evaluation by myself. Sir, are you sure? One of the employees asked, as it was unusual to be sent home this early in the day. Project Velocity didn't have a set-in-stone schedule for most things, as most of the timing was determined by how fast the trainee learned and improved. Yet to be sent home only a few hours after the business day started. Yes, now go, Maro said, and not wanting to wait around for him to change his mind. The members of Project Velocity quickly gathered their things and left. Takami looked at Maro with a look asking to be excused. Sorry Takami, but you'll be staying. If you are going to train with these boys, then you need to see their level of control. Takami didn't say a word, just gave a small nod. Maro then turned to Izuku and Bakugo and said, How about a small demonstration of your quirks? Then I'll set up some small tests for you to go through. Midoriya, how about we start with you? Maro prepared as he needed to act, as if he had never seen a quirk like Izuku before. To make it seem that Izuku's quirk itself was unique to Izuku. Izuku nodded and lifted his right arm. Maro was ready to see Izuku contort into a weird angle, but his eyes grew as smoke appeared around Izuku's arm. The next second Izuku's quirks took hold and his right arm was transformed, extending and building to a rifle. Maro held his breath as he looked over Izuku's quirk. It was so similar yet so different from Kaina's. The same sleek barrel design, but Izuku's rifle had a forestock and a body. It had no area for a magazine yet, instead of loading a bullet through his hand as Kaina had to do. Where the charging bolt would be on a normal rifle, there was a small slot. Well, young man, that is quite impressive. How about you give us a demonstration of your quirk? Pick a target and show us what you've got, Maro said as he felt the joy of being able to correct past mistakes once again. This time Maro would have to play his card close to his chest, to compartmentalize information so no one knew more than they needed to. But if this worked out, Maro knew he could become head of a new hero program, one that could produce more heroes at a higher quality than any hero school could. Izuku looked around and quickly spotted a target. It was up in a corner, perhaps 100 feet away, and there were no other targets that were blocking it. Izuku took a knee as he gripped the barrel of his quirk with his left hand. Resting his left arm on his left knee to help keep his right arm steady, Izuku found this position to be very comfortable. He had complete control of where he was aiming. There was no sway in his arm as it stayed perfectly still. Maro noticed this too, as Kaina had often assumed a similar pose early in her training, whenever she didn't have anything to rest her barrel against. It wasn't a bad form, but in combat, it was a pose that left Izuku and Kaina vulnerable to almost all angles. Izuku lined up his aim, the best he could, then flexed his right arm. A loud gunshot went off, causing everyone that could to cover their ears. They all watched as the green and purple bullet whizzed through the air and soon struck the target. It wasn't a bullseye, not even within the inner circles. Izuku had barely even hit the target in the first place. Yet Maro was still impressed. Izuku had only had his quirk for 2 weeks. And though it was clear he hadn't had much practice, Izuku definitely had a talent for using his quirk. Through practice, Izuku could quickly get to the same level as long-range pro heroes such as Snipe. One day he might even be able to give Kaina a run for her money. A well-placed shot, young Midoriya, and with how short of a time you've had your quirk. You most certainly do have a talent for it. Now anything else you would like to show about your quirk? Maro asked. Izuku nodded his head, then weaved some of his hair into a bullet. I can weave my hair into my ammo. Maro nodded as if he had heard nothing about that piece of information. He then turned to Bakugo and said, Now I believe it's young Bakugo's turn. Inko seemed to be under the impression that Bakugo would be fit for Project Velocity. Yet that particular decision wouldn't be up to Maro. The HPSC Council would be the ones to decide whether Maro would be allowed to train either of the boys. Maro hadn't many interactions with Mitsuki and Maru, only having met them for the first time at Inko's wedding, as Mitsuki had been one of Inko's maids. If he remembered correctly, Mitsuki's quirk allowed her to sweat glycerin, while Marasu's quirk allowed him to secrete acidic sweat that could cause small explosions. Maro got a small smile at what a perfect combination could result from those quirks, and if Bakugo had it. Maro was pulled from his thoughts as Bakugo stepped forward and said, I'll show you, old man. With my quirk, I'm going to make me the next #1 hero. Bakugo raised his hand in a cupped formation and let off a good-sized explosion. Later, after reviewing the security footage, Maro measured the explosion to be about the size of a large SUV. But for now, Maro got a big grin on his face as fate had just handed him 2 extremely powerful quirks on a silver platter. Project Velocity's future was brighter than Maro could even predict. He had to train Izuku and Bakugo, even if he had to fight against the HPSC Council or the board. Maro was going to do everything he could to show the masterpiece that is Project Velocity. Maro cleared his throat as he turned to Inko and said, 2 impressive quirk. Perfect fit for Project Velocity. Something I'm sure the council will see that for themselves without much explanation. Let's have you return in 3 days' time, and we'll begin their training. Inko bowed slightly to show her appreciation, then turned to Izuku and Bakugo. All right, it's time to leave, boys. But we just got here. We want to use our quirks, Izuku said. They had barely been here for 10 minutes, and barely had a chance to use their quirks. Maro smiled and said, Boys, you'll have plenty of chances to use your quirks in the future. But for now, the best you can do is listen to your mothers. Just remember, when you train without a direction in mind, then you'll never move forwards. With that word of advice, Izuku and Bakugo accepted Inko's hand, and she walked them to the elevator. Neither of them could wait until they could train with their quirks. Though their reason for wanting to be heroes were different, they both wanted to give their best to become #1 hero. They both admired All Might, the symbol of peace, and now they had the opportunity to train to become heroes like him. After sending Takami home, Maro finished up some paperwork and then went home. As he settled down for the evening, his phone buzzed. Maro pulled it out and saw a text that he had been expecting for days. Fumiko Maro, for violating Section 1015B of Project Velocity set by its council, you are to appear before the council in 2 days, at which your recent choices will be questioned and your viability as acting director over the program will be decided. Maro sighed as he turned his phone off and tossed it onto his nightstand. He wasn't too worried. He knew eventually the council would hear about it. And now he knew they had been told by one of the 4 members of Project Velocity that had been there today. He wanted to figure out who the mole was because he hated how much of a hold the council had over his program. But now that would have to be put on the back burner, as the next day Maro gathered everything he had been personally preparing over the past week. In the evening, he caught a plane to Tokyo. Then 2 days after Maro had met Izuku and Bakugo, he was standing in front of the Project Velocity Council. A group of HPSC workers that had been selected to oversee the program were also the ones that decided whether Maro was allowed to stay within the program. And as Maro was not going to lose his life mission, he made sure one last time everything was in order before he left his hotel room. One way or another, he was going to make sure Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo were brought into Project Velocity. He didn't care how much convincing it took. Something he didn't think would take much. He was ready to pull out all the stops. He had the security footage of their tests, just to show the strength of their quirks. He had their state-issue quirk documents. He had even managed to get their grade from school to show how smart they were. And it was not lost on him that some on the council liked the idea of having pro heroes trained by them, and purely on their payroll. Maro arrived at the Hero Public Safety Commission headquarters, and after scanning his ID, Maro headed to the elevator. He rode the elevator up to the 39th floor. Once the elevator doors opened, Maro walked out and headed over to the reception desk. He put his ID card on the desk and said, Fumiko Maro, reporting for the meeting at 10 o'clock. The receptionist took Maro's ID and scanned it. Once the light turned green, she returned the ID to Maro and said, Please have a seat. You'll be called when they're ready." After taking and slipping his ID card back into his wallet, Maro turned away from the reception desk and walked over a grouping of chairs. He selected one of the chairs and sat down as he rested his briefcase against the side of the chair. With nothing else to do, Maro thought about what he was going to say, as his word choice was going to be very important in the meeting. 15 minutes later, the receptionist called out, "Maro, they're ready for you." Maro thanked the receptionist as he grabbed his briefcase and stood up. He walked over to the set of double doors and closed the handle. He let out a slow breath and pulled the door open. On the other side, he was expecting to see the HPSC Council, and he did. Yet what he was not prepared for was to see Madam President of the Hero Public Safety Commission and Prime Minister Kuma Renzo in their respective chairs. Convincing the council was easy. Maro had personally known them for years and knew the kind of people there were. Yet there were two or some of the highest authorities in Japan, and Maro had only met Madam President twice in person. As Maro met the eyes of Prime Minister Renzo, he bowed and said, "Madam President, Prime Minister Renzo, I was unaware that you would be joining us for this meeting." "Yes, but Council Member Takuma had the mind to inform us of your two potential recruits. After the success of Keigo Takami, codenamed Hawks, your control over Project Velocity was limited but reinstated. Part of that limit was power given to this council to oversee any part of the program, checks and balances, as our American friends put in their beginning. Power which was not only given to this council to myself and Prime Minister Renzo. Power something you seem to have forgotten," Madam President said as she sternly looked at Maro. Her eyes were narrow and focused on Maro, with her lips pursed, showing her readiness to finally put Maro in his grave. "I remember that agreement quite well. You are allowed to limit my control of Project Velocity, should it appear that events of the past were to occur again," Maro said as he sat down in his chair and put his briefcase on the table. Whenever Madam President took it upon herself to check on Project Velocity, Maro always had to hold his tongue around her. He didn't like that he had lost his project to her control. Events of the past were to occur again. That does seem to be the future of Project Velocity, or did you not think it was important to think of that when you brought Izuku Tsutsumi in the other day?" Madam President said. "That was merely a power assessment. Inko Midoriya calling in a favor for her son. Nothing beyond old friends," Maro said. "Do you honestly believe that we would believe that? It's clear that you want to bring Izuku Tsutsumi into Project Velocity. We all know the possible future that comes from that. Or are you too blind by correcting your past mistakes to see that?" Madam President said, and Maro began to speak, but he was cut off. "We know you are watering the idea of using Kaina Tsutsumi's children, Izuku Midoriya. If you wish to train him, turn into a pro-hero. And as it seems your method have not changed, how can you guarantee that events of the past do not occur again?" "True intentions, madam?" Maro asked, knowing where Madam President was going. It was the same argument she had used to gain control from Maro. Her press corps was right. Once people learned of Project Velocity, they would think the HPSC was working on creating a privatized army. However, Maro never thought that way of thinking could come from someone within the HPSC. Was your original plan for Project Velocity not to train future heroes from a young age to become war dogs for the Hero Public Safety Commission?" Madam President asked as she drew out a folder. Maro recognized his original proposal plan from when he was trying to get Project Velocity sanctioned. Maro looked at the folder. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. He tossed them onto the table, making sure the flash drive keychain was one on top. "I never used that terminology, something I remind myself weekly. I used the flash drive as needed to remind myself what Project Velocity was designed to be. Its purpose was to train pro-heroes that were upheld to the quality wanted and needed by the Hero Public Safety Commission. Something that, and I know I don't stand alone in this, many pro-heroes are lacking in. A politician's way of saying war dogs, and isn't that what you got? Lady Nagant, skills given to her to make her obedient to the HPSC. She didn't question her orders, the wrong kind of soldier. I would call that a war dog, an obedient one at that. Yet eventually her humanity caught up in the end, and because of that she killed my predecessor," Madam President said, a small smirk appearing on her face. She was playing it perfectly to make it seem that Project Velocity just needed to be disbanded. That was what she had been trying to do from the beginning, as she had her program to train young heroes. Yet it would never get off the ground as long as Project Velocity was still around. "Madam President, are you insinuating that this council is corrupt and ordering Lady Nagant to kill others in cold blood without anything more than personal agendas?" Maro asked. He would not have Project Velocity. A program that was nothing more than a program to help teach and train young kids with powerful quirks how to become heroes. Name be dragged through the mud. Yet the thought of a military-style army could be formed from the idea of Project Velocity. But that was never the true purpose of the program. I am not insinuating anything of the sort, Mr. Maro, Madam President said, her voice becoming stern. She had a chance to finally knock Maro's legs out from under him, and she would not be losing this time. Project Velocity should be nothing more than a stepping stone for her program and her career. Madam President and Maro looked at each other, until Prime Minister Renzo cleared his throat. Everyone immediately looked at him as he adjusted his collar. Madam President, I am aware of how hard you have voted to terminate Fumiko Maro's position over Project Velocity. You believe he was the sole reason the program failed in its first trial. Yet, as I have reviewed the history of this program, I have found Mr. Maro was not the sole issue with the program. Many decisions he made were contributory to the result, but not the main factor, and like any new idea, there were bound to be obstacles to overcome. Maro began to smile. Mr. Maro, do not think that is justification for the failure that occurred as it was still on your watch. Failures were going to happen, but the one that happened was unexpected and could have been prevented if certain choices or actions had occurred. Despite this, I believe Fumiko Maro is still the best man to occupy his position as head of Project Velocity. His success with the young hawk has shown that if nothing else, he and his program can and are willing to improve themselves until they become what they were always meant to be. Thank you, sir, Maro said quickly, standing up and bowing. However, Mr. Maro, it does seem that you have forgotten the history of Project Velocity. So please explain to me and these fine people why training Izuku Midoriya and his friend Katsuki Bakugo would not allow history to repeat itself. So let us start with their quirk. Katsuki Bakugo first, Prime Minister Renzo said. Maro took a breather. They were getting to the part where he was in control. Yes, sir. Katsuki Bakugo, quirk, explosion. This quirk allows him to secrete a substance similar to liquid nitroglycan within the palm of his hand. He can ignite the liquid on command, allowing him to create destructive explosions. The more he sweats, the more powerful his explosions can become, though dehydration is suspected to occur sooner than normal. What of his personality? In the video footage, he acted straightforward. Prime Minister Renzo commented as Bakugo was quick to show off his quirk and act smug about it. He's a hard-headed kid, I will admit to that, but his heart is in the right place. He believes he can be the next #1 hero, better than All Might, and he has the drive to back that up. In the short time since he has gained his quirk, his understanding and control over the fundamentals of his quirk is beyond that of a middle school student. He's to the point where he understands how the positioning and formation of his hands can affect his quirk. In the security footage, Katsuki Bakugo can be seen cupping his hand together before igniting his sweat. He did this because he understood what it meant, giving him more control of the direction of his quirk. Maro said as he opened his briefcase and pulled out a photo taken from the security footage when Bakugo's explosion was at its peak. He slipped it down the table and managed to stop it right in front of Prime Minister Renzo. Prime Minister Renzo grabbed the photo and turned it around to look at it. With training from Project Velocity, I believe that one day he may begin to use his quirk to gain spatial advantage, using a series of explosions to get him to hover in the air. Each in turn could allow him to attack from any angle. More of an endeavor than an All Might, Madam President said. Dislike for the #20 hero was common among the HPSC, even the bottom of the totem pole workers. All his activities and battles created a lot of paperwork for them to do. In a way, yes, but I believe without the worst qualities, Maro said. A bit surprised he and Madam President were able to agree on something. Through something such as that wasn't that big of a victory in Maro's book. Prime Minister Renzo let go of the photo and focused on Maro. And what of Izuku Midoriya? He is the main concern for this council. As we have seen in the past, what can occur? Lady Nagant was a powerful and skilled hero. So what words do you have to convince us that you should be allowed to train him to become a pro hero? Prime Minister Renzo said. Thank you, Prime Minister Renzo. Izuku Midoriya has the same quirk as his mother rifle. When using his quirk, Midoriya's forearm and hand transform into the barrel and body of a long-range rifle. This allows him to shoot bullets weaved from his hair at long distances. Instead of inserting ammunition through his hand, Midoriya does so through a small hole on his forearm. His ammo count and range are unknown at the moment. And for his personality, I can explain it all in a few words. Izuku Midoriya does not know who he is, Maro said. Through this training, Izuku was going to be a good showing of nature versus nurture. If Izuku never knew he was the son of a notorious killer, Then the only way he could become evil was through his unknown nature. Expound, Madam President said, leaning back in her chair. She had fought hard to have Maro kicked off of Project Velocity, but now it seemed he had lost his mind. Even if he was allowed to train Izuku Midoriya, all Madam President would have to do is wait for Maro's plan to blow up in his face. In short, Izuku Midoriya does not know that Kaine Tsutsumi, Lady Nagant, is his mother. Nor does her sister Inko Midoriya know what occurred that day over a year ago. Mrs. Midoriya knows the story given to the media is not the truth. I'm sure she would have been able to figure that out on her own. More to the point, she does not know the truth. She believes that her sister was being hunted, and when Tsutsumi escaped, the people that were after her framed her for killing those heroes. This has led to Inko Midoriya believing that someone hunted down her sister, and now those same people may be after her and her son. That is why she contacted me. She wants to protect her son and help him become a pro-hero. I asked if Izuku Midoriya knew who he really was, and Mrs. Midoriya informed that he had been lied to. Izuku Midoriya with his entire being believes himself to be the son of Inko and Hisashi Midoriya, and has no knowledge of Kaine Tsutsumi or his connection to her. Maro explained. What if the boy was to learn the truth? The media has not mentioned Lady Nagant since the month after her betrayal, yet once this boy became a hero, the media of the past is sure to question his connection to her. Evidence will be brought to light, and the boy may come to question his past. He may question who he is and may seek his biological mother out. He'll have more than a few questions for her, and what do you think he'll do when he tells the truth? Prime Minister Renzo asked, keeping a neutral expression. Hiding the truth will be difficult when that time comes. But for now the past can stay hidden without much help. When Izuku Midoriya learns the truth, then it will be at an age when it will not affect him, Maro said. What do you mean? Can you be sure by training Tsutsumi that you aren't creating a worse problem? Madam President said. It shouldn't matter when it acts. When the truth comes to light, Izuku's world would shatter. Something Madam President was counting out. Something she was going to make happen. Madam President, if I may be so bold to ask a question of my own. What is starting Izuku Midoriya from becoming a pro-hero in the first place? Maro asked in a strong voice that caught Madam President off guard. He used her silence to answer his question. Nothing. If it's not through Project Velocity, then it will be through the means everyone does so. He'll train himself, make himself ready for any test from any hero school. Who's to say Mrs. Midoriya won't be the one training him? Either Izuku Midoriya becomes a hero through us or through Yua. And who would you rather have to control over him? All Project Velocity would be doing is damage control. So when he turns, learn the truth. He had trust in us, and at the least we'll be able to stop him. Madam President scoffed and said, what to stop Yua from kicking Tsutsumi out? They wouldn't be too happy once they see his quirk. Then what's to stop Midoriya from turning into a vigilante? He wants to be a hero badly. To protect those around him. Or worse, he could become a villain looking for revenge. I think the principal of Yua would be able to see that too. Can you? Maro said, but didn't let Madam President get a word in. He let out a breath and continued with, there's many possibilities that we can choose from. Enlisting Izuku Midoriya into gives us best control of choosing the option we want. Are you sure this is the best option? Prime Minister Renzo said. I see possibilities. First, Midoriya gives up on being a pro-hero. Unlikely to happen. Second, Midoriya becomes a pro-hero through UA and never learns the truth. Third, Midoriya becomes a pro-hero through the program and never learns the truth. Both of these are possible. Fourth is Midoriya becomes a pro-hero through UA and learns the truth once people, teachers, students see his quirk. He shunned, and after enough time became something less than heroic. Then as per usual we've the ones that have to deal with it. Fifth, he becomes a pro-hero through Project Velocity, and when he learns the truth, he has enough trust in us. I see the fifth being the best, because we'll be able to control what he sees, what he hears, and what he learns. We train him to be mentally strong enough to take the truth, teaching him that can be a hero despite what everyone thinks. Maro looked at Prime Minister Renzo, who stayed silent for minutes. Every second Maro could feel his heart beating inside his chest. He understood this truly between him and Madam President and Prime Minister Renzo say was the only one that mattered. Maro kept his focus on Prime Minister Renzo. At some point, Prime Minister Renzo stood up, pushing his chair back as he did so. He looked Maro dead in the eyes and said, Fumiko Maro, you are being entrusted to train Izuku Midoriya and his friend Katsuki Bakugo. You are to train them to become pro-heroes, but with the trust to ensure the past does not occur again, and with the knowledge that if you fail your obligations, your life will be forfeit to the government of Japan. You will strip off your title as acting director, your work will be destroyed, your name branded worse than villains, and you will spend the rest of your life making up for the lives taken by Izuku Tsutsumi. Do you understand? Maro swallowed his tongue and bowed as he forced out, "Yes, sir. You may leave," Prime Minister Renzo said and pointed to the door behind Maro. Maro came out of his bow and grabbed his briefcase. He began to walk to the door but stopped. He then looked back over his shoulder at Prime Minister Renzo and asked, "If fate finds an ill opinion of me, sir, what would become of my wife? If sin falls, then it will rest squarely on your shoulder. But understand those that would be touched if that should happen. Your wife will be barred, Inko Midoriya as well. The blame will fall squarely on you, but it won't only be your fate touched." Prime Minister Renzo said. "I understand, sir," Maro said with a nod, then held out of the door. He felt his heart pounding on his chest. He needed to calm his nerves. Why did he have to give up smoking? Once Maro returned home, he held a small celebration with his wife. While his wife was always supportive of her husband's antics, she did have some concerns over Izuku being the son of Lady Nagant. But she had also walked the girls growing up. She had a soft spot for them. She did prefer Inko, but Mrs. Maro was happy with how much Kana wanted to protect her younger sister. Maro promised that she would be able to meet the boys as well, but it won't be for some time. The following Sunday was the start of everything. Izuku and Bakugo were brought back to the training facility, along with Inko and Mitsuki. Once in the building, they rode the elevator up to the 5th floor, where they found Maro waiting for them. When they walked out of the elevator, he turned away from an overturned whiteboard and looked at them, putting a smile on for them. "Good afternoon and good news, the council has approved the training of Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo. Today will be day 1 of their training to become pro heroes. I'm pretty new to this, and Inko has explained a bit. But how exactly will you be training our sons?" Mitsuki asked. She had never had an interest in becoming a pro hero. She had always chosen to be a fashion model as her dream career, and she didn't expect there to be much overlap. It was actually her pursuit of fashion design that sparked her friendship with Inko. Inko always claimed that it was because Mitsuki wouldn't leave her alone, but Mitsuki just saw it as giving some much-needed friendly advice. Maro gave a small chuckle as he walked back to the whiteboard and flipped it around. Anticipating this, I took the liberty of writing some stuff down. On the whiteboard were several different items ranging from nutritional balance to increase muscle growth and recovery time, to the amount of training that would be done each day to maximize growth in skill and muscles, while not damaging the body. Mitsuki and Inko looked over the board. Inko didn't remember Project Velocity being this organized when she was being trained. It seemed in the years since she left, the program had become more refined. The two mothers looked down on their sons, as it was clear they had a lot of work they would have to deal with. Yet they looked more eager than ever before. "This is Inko paused as she tried to figure out the best word to use. "A bit much," Mitsuki said, not worrying about finding the right word. "They are only 5 years old." Maro looked at the board and saw how misleading it could be. "Oh, forgive me, much of this information wouldn't come into play until later. But Inko, you can project velocity has come a long way since your time here." Maro flipped the whiteboard back around. "For now, we'll begin with the basics. Learning what limits their quirks have." "But you have their government quirk files." Mitsuki pointed it out. Maro worked for the HPSC, so he should be able to easily get a hold of any government document. Before Maro could ask, Inko did so. "A file can tell a story, but not the whole story. When I first joined the program, it was believed that I could only pull small objects to me. But as my quirk was tested and stretched, I learned that I could do more than just pull small objects to me. I had telekinesis in its entirety." "Precisely. That is why it's common for someone to change their quirk file as they get older, as they come to better understand how their quirk works. It happens all the time, even with more common style quirks. No two quirks are exactly the same. It's those little differences that can be the most important. We don't have that much time, so step 1 is figuring out how exactly their quirks work. How does that sound, boys?" Maro asked, looking at Izuku and Bakugo. They looked at each other, then back at Maro and began nodding their heads. They couldn't wait to learn what the limits of their quirks were. How powerful they were, how powerful they could become. If it meant getting one step closer to becoming a pro hero, then they were up for anything, and they were excited. Maro chuckled a bit at their enthusiasm, hopeful they would keep it over the years. It would be important to keep it as the driving force that got them out of bed every day and continue training. For the rest of the day, Maro ran tests to have a better understanding of their quirk. At the end of the day, Maro sent them home with the homework that they needed to think of unique ways to use their quirks. Didn't matter if it looked stupid or useless, any kind of skill could have its uses. Over the next month, Maro trained with the boys and the range of their quirks. Izuku learned the range of his quirk was a mere 200 meters, but through training and practice, he was able to slowly increase that range and his accuracy. He was able to place nearly every shot into the center of the target, something he always smiled at no matter how often he got a bullseye. Bakugo focused on his quirk recoiling on his body and how he could use the momentum generated by his explosion to move around his enemy and attack from different angles. They often came home Sunday evenings exhausted, and this caused their mother to believe their schoolwork would suffer. But every Monday they were up out of bed and eager to go to school. The boy paid attention in class and was the top student, earning the highest scores in each of their classes. Especially their education grew so quickly, they were easily months ahead of their fellow classmates. So part of training became further their education. Yet no matter how hard the week was or how long it felt, on Saturday morning the two of them were as excited as ever to train. In the coming year, as the two practiced with their quirks, they gained a strong fundamental understanding of their quirks. By the time of his 6th birthday, Izuku was able to increase his range to 300 meters and learned that he could hold a total of 60 bullets, and he could hold them for 2 weeks before they disappeared and needed to be replaced. On the other hand, Bakugo learned that while his quirk was mainly in his hands, if he focused long enough he could get a smaller explosion to form around his body. With every new skill they learned, they practiced and trained until they had perfected it. By the time they were 7, they had skills that most first-year hero students didn't. But that didn't stop them, as Izuku and Bakugo would spend evenings together thinking of new ways to use their quirk. Many ideas were found to be just impossible, while there were a few that would have to wait until their bodies and quirks were stronger. This irked Takami a bit, using younger kids easily matching up to his skill levels. He refused to be beaten by some brats. Though that didn't diminish his friendship with them, he enjoyed hanging out with them, even coming over to either of their houses for dinner often. Their time together was mostly spent training under the program. They tried to get together outside of training. Once Maro was sure the two of them had an adequate handle on their quirk, he moved them onto the skill part of training. Martial arts, it being decided that karate and judo would best suit them. Then beginning Bukijutsu once Mitsuki and Inko were comfortable with their son handling weapons. It was 2 weeks after Izuku's 7th birthday, and it was Mitsuki's train to drive them in. And as Maro had called the previous night, telling them he had a surprise for them, Izuku and Bikago were very eager to arrive. Once Mitsuki parked the car and unlocked the doors, Bakugo and Izuku rushed out of the car. Mitsuki cursed a bit as she fumbled to get out of the car and had to run after them, all the way screaming, "Wait, you like maggot. Stress doesn't look good on me." Mitsuki managed to catch up to them as they ran through the front doors. However, she wasn't able to catch her breath until they got into the elevator. She shot a glare at the two of them as she was doubling over and breathing heavily. Mitsuki was in good shape. She had to be a fashion model. But there was a difference between a fashion model and a professional athlete. Mitsuki was still catching her breath as the elevator arrived on the 5th floor and Izuku and Bakugo rushed out. They found Maro waiting for them, his kind smile very evident, and behind him were 2 people dressed in martial arts attire, both having black belts tied around their waists. The gentleman on Maro's right was of a large frame and tall stature. He held a narrow look on the boys, as he had his hands folded against his chest. His black hair was cut to right above his shoulder and slicked back so as not to impede his vision. He had a weathered look, with a scar that started under his left ear followed back his jawline and ended at his chin. He looked over the 2 boys, their strength evident in their tiny frames. The woman on Maro's left was of a shorter stature and smaller frame, but she didn't look less immediate. Her blonde hair was braided behind her head and went down to her waist. Her piercing green eyes made it feel as if her stare was going straight through Izuku and Bakugo. She gave an animalistic smile that she knew put her co-workers on edge. She was going to enjoy seeing what the two were made of. And while the man was barefoot and had no gloves, the woman had a pair of fingerless gloves and socks on. "Good morning, boys. I'm glad to see you are as eager to train as ever. Today I would like you to meet your new instructors. Sensei Hakaku and Sensei Hidamu are hero public safety workers, but they are masters of the art of karate and judo, and they have agreed to train you too. You will train with your respective sensei, and then every 2 weeks you will switch and train with the other sensei. And when they agree you have the basics down, you will be trained on how to use your new skills in tandem with your quirks. Any questions?" Maro asked, and when neither of the young boys spoke up he continued with, For now, Midoriya, you're with Sensei Hitomu. Bakugo, you're with Sensei Hakaku. The two boys looked over their new mentors, and then bowed, yelling, "Thank you for teaching us." "Dismissed. Your new uniforms are in the changing rooms," Maro said, waving the boys off to get changed. While the boys disappeared to change, Sensei Hakaku leaned over to Sensei Hitomu and whispered. Maro undersold how eager they would be towards being trained. I could feel my frozen heart being thawed from their smiles. Sensei Hakaku. Well, don't get your hopes up. Not even Endeavor can do that. Everyone's eager in the beginning. They all eventually break, and then the real training begins. Sensei Hitomu said in a downtrodden voice as she shook her head. The boys returned shortly after, wearing martial arts attire that Maro had set aside for them. Sensei Hitomu looked at Izuku and said, "All right, Dai Job. Looks like you're with me for the next 2 weeks. Come with me." Izuku bowed, then followed Sensei Hitomu to a different area of the floor, where some padded floor mats were waiting for them. Izuku looked them over, then turned to Sensei Kuma to ask a question. "How are we going to begin?" He was interrupted as he saw a fist getting close to his face. Yet before the attack could connect, he jumped back and landed on his hands, as if to springboard himself further away from Sensei Hitomu. However, he didn't. He just put his feet back on the ground and began to stand. Yet those few seconds, Sensei Hitomu used her speed to get in close. Just as Izuku was straightening her back, Sensei Hitomu dropped down and swept Izuku's feet out from under him. It took Izuku and gravity to realize his feet were no longer under him. Just as Izuku realized he was no longer standing, his head hit the pads. If it wasn't for the pads, he would have likely been knocked unconscious. Sloppy and lazy. Maro told us you have some close quarters training, but obviously you are still a novice. You need to train those skills until they become second nature. Until you can act as such without having to think about it. Or you would have reacted towards my follow-up attack and not currently be on the floor. Your reflexes are good, a positive side effect. No doubt from your enchanted eyesight. Sensei Hakaku, and I's purpose here is not just to teach you the art of karate and judo, but to expand your mind in the art of martial arts. To teach you the skills to win against any opponent, and part of that is reading your opponent's movements and reacting accordingly. Sensei Hitomu said as she held out a hand to help Izuku to his feet. Izuku took his hand and was hauled to his feet. Once had his balance, he readjusted the shoulder of his gi, as it had begun to become loose. As he did, in his peripheral vision, he saw Sensei Hitomu attacking. With her advice still in his ear, instead of jumping back, Izuku dove to the side and quickly rolled out of the way. However, as he sprung back up to his knees, Sensei Hitomu was waiting for him and put Izuku in a headlock. You were quicker and more effective this time, but a well-trained opponent knows the same move won't work twice. After every fight, anyone could improve and become better, but those who can improve themselves during a fight are those who always find victory. Sensei Hitomu said as she increased the pressure on Izuku's neck. The edge of his vision was starting to go black and his eyes were bulging, but he would still breathe for the most part. But this isn't like those video games you kids play. You're not the only one that leveled up. While you learn about your opponent's moves, your opponents will be studying yours. There are steps to mastering a skill. First, there are the basics. Improve upon those to have a solid foundation. Then comes advancing your skills, learning attacks that have more risk, but more rewards. But always be cautious, as there is always room for failure. Then comes mastery. Your movements and skills are now second nature. You are able to react and fight through years of practice and training. Your body and mind become one. Sensei Hitomu released Izuku. Izuku leaned forward and worked to catch his breath. He took slow breaths until his vision turned to normal. Izuku then stood up and faced his sensei. Now tell me what comes after mastery of skill. Izuku paused as he couldn't guess. Mastery of anything was supposed to be the highest level a person could achieve. I do not know, Sensei. Sensei Hitomu wasn't expecting Izuku to know. He was only 6 years old, and it wasn't something many learned of. Few learn what the final step is, and fewer learn how to achieve it. So when you learn what the final step is, that's when you become unbeatable. I understand, Sensei, Izuku said, with a bow. Sensei Hitomu gave a small smile. Before she retired from being a judo instructor and became a worker for the Hero Public Safety Commission, she had seen many people come into her dojo, all eager to learn how to fight. Yet the longest she had seen someone stay as eager as they were when they first walked in was 1 week. Past that, many dropped out, and those who stayed lost their spark to learn more. She was hoping Izuku wasn't like that. Tell me, kid, what's your purpose here? Izuku was confused and showed it on his face. He thought it was obvious. Aren't I here to train in judo and karate? He didn't know that this morning. But that was what he was doing here. Sensei Hidemu laughed and said, "You really are an innocent kid. Die job. Why are you here? What force drove you to get out of bed and made you come here to suffer through training that would make most grown adults cry?" Izuku thought about it for a second, still confused. And then he understood what his new sensei was asking. "I want to be a hero. To be able to rescue others with a smile on my face, as All Might does every day." Sensei Hidemu looked Izuku in the eyes. Izuku believed in the purpose he had just stated. But under the stare he was getting, he began to wonder if that was the wrong answer. No, it was the right answer. It was if he understood what it meant. Everyone said they wanted to be liked by All Might. He became the most popular hero. But what did it mean to be All Might? What skills would Izuku have to learn? What kind of training would be needed? And what practice would he have to learn to fight, while always having a smile on his face? Fanboy, aren't you? So is the rest of the world, kid. You say those words, but you are here to prove them. So let's start with the basics. Sensei Hidemu said, holding out her hand in a handshake gesture. Izuku reached forwards to shake Sensei Hidemu's hand. However, Sensei Hidemu grabbed Izuku's wrist. Before Izuku knew what was happening, he was lifted above her shoulder and slammed him into the ground. Izuku tried to take a breath, but Sensei Hidemu was quick to wrap Izuku's arm with her legs, and then cut off Izuku's airway with her ankles. And step 1 to learning is learning how it feels to be put into lock. You want to do it properly, you need to know how it feels to be on the receiving end. Feel how your body becomes locked, and is now no longer able to move on its own. The force of your opponents becoming an immovable wall that you have little chance of pushing back. To learn this, for the next 2 weeks, you'll be like this. You with your back on the floor, looking up at the ceiling. Once you have that, then I'll teach you how to free yourself. I understand, Sensei, Izuku said in a breathless voice. Sensei Hidemu looked over Izuku, and she believed there was some truth to Izuku's statement. Within only a few minutes, Izuku had gained a better understanding of what it meant to be a pro hero, and what it meant to train within martial arts. And that was more than most people she met. The rest of the day, Izuku was put into different judo locks of bent arm, leg arm, cross arm, straight arm, and knee arm. Sensei Kuma forced Izuku to hold each lock for 10 minutes, while instructing him to feel how the different locks moved his muscles, forcing his tendons to an extreme range of motion. How that prevented him from moving whatever was being locked, and how it immobilized the other parts of his body. Bakugo wasn't much better. He spent just as much time on the mat as Izuku did. He had spent the whole day learning how to block an attack. That or learning how to take a punch or a kick. When the two of them got home, they were never more grateful to be about to take a warm shower than to go to bed. While both options, judo and karate, were open to Izuku and Bakugo, they still had their preferences. Bakugo excelled at karate, getting the basic stance and form down quickly, while Izuku had taken to judo like a prodigy. Every time Sensei Hidemu showed him a new move, Izuku internalized everything. How his body felt, how it was unable to respond, and most importantly how Sensei Hidemu taught him to break free. Over the next 6 months, Izuku and Bakugo's skills improved greatly as their sensei held nothing back. By the time winter hit, the boys had a good enough baseline that Maro saw fit to let them use their quirks during martial training. That was where they would learn how to use their new skills and quirk in tandem. So in terms of karate, Bakugo practiced adding force to his attacks with his explosions. With a palm thrust, unleashing an explosion as his fist hit to increase the force directly into his opponent's chest. While within judo, Izuku worked on the timing of transforming his arm to suddenly increase the range of his attack and push his opponents away from it. On the side, Izuku learned how to create better leverage with his elongated arm to either break out of a hold or to better immobilize his opponents without having to use much strength. While they practiced these skills with Sensei Hakaku and Sensei Hidemu, the boys found it better to practice with each other. So every first Saturday of each month was set aside for the boys to spar against each other and train with someone of their own skill level. Maro noticed along with the sensei that as soon as the spar, the boys' already accelerated growth was becoming more so. And Maro remembered how well Kaina and Inko had progressed when they fought each other. Every day Maro marked their boys' progress, and every day he was satisfied with how well everything was coming together. Project Velocity had just started out a program to feel a problem no thought the world had. He was lucky that the old HPSC president saw the same program. He was lucky to find Kaina and Inko. He was lucky that when it came down to it was decided he was too invaluable to the program to taste to the side. He was lucky to be able to find Takami, and now he was lucky that he was training Izuku and Bakugo. Maro turned off his computer after finishing the day's assessment. As he stood up, he couldn't help but wonder when his luck was going to run out. If he was lucky, never. But like all other recourse, eventually, it would be run dry. As it was standard for Project Velocity to give time to lay a foundation for new trainees, Izuku and Bakugo's first major evaluation wasn't until they were 8. And knowing that headline ahead of time, Maro used every second to get the boys ready. He had faith they would pass, but he was a more cautious man in his old age, and he was sure Madam President would try to make it so the evaluation held a ridiculous standard. She would try to make it seem the boys were unfit to become pro-heroes, as if they weren't up to the Hero Public Safety Commission's standard, to her standards. So this time Maro wasn't taking any kind of chances. The evaluation was set for July 24th and Maro had the date set and marked on his calendar with a big red circle. And as the fateful day got closer and closer, he tried not to stress about it too much. Yet he found himself reaching into his inner pocket, looking for his cigarette more and more often. He was sure he was handling it well enough, as no one asked him or mentioned that he looked stressed, except for his wife. Then again, she knew everything about him, so there was no fooling her. On the day of the evaluation, Izuku woke up to his alarm, the All Might theme song, at 7 o'clock in the morning. With a small yawn, Izuku reached over and held the off button, and the silence filled his room. He sat up in bed and shook his head to make the fog of sleep disappear from his mind. Let out another small yawn, Izuku got out of bed and walked over to his window. He mindlessly opened the blind to let in the sunlight, as he was the kind of person who couldn't fall asleep if there was any kind of light in his room. As soon as the sunlight hit Izuku's eyes directly, he felt himself wake up more. This allowed him to focus outside the window, and the day. It looked like it was going to be warm and sunny, perfect for summer to go to the beach and swim. Unfortunately, he was going to be spending most of it indoors. Stepping away from the window, Izuku brushed his ever-growing hair out from in front of him. The motion of brushing his hair out of his face reminded him why he needed to wake up so early. Izuku walked across his room and lazily headed out into the hallway. Once he reached the bathroom, he headed inside. Once inside, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror and saw how long his hair had gotten. Even with his hair cut only 3 weeks ago, it is already starting to reach past his neck. Izuku sighed as if that was going to be a battle. Keeping his hair at a normal length, he was going to fight his entire life. Pulling himself away from his reflection, Izuku walked over to the shower and drew back the curtains and turned the knob to hot. As Izuku waited for his shower to warm up, he shuffled back over to the sink and grabbed his toothbrush and toothpaste. After wetting the bristle and putting on some toothpaste, Izuku set about brushing his teeth. While Izuku often came home from training tired or exhausted, Inko never let him skip his hygiene. By the time he was done brushing his teeth, the shower had warmed up to a comfortable temperature. Izuku stripped off his pajamas and hopped into the shower. What little sleep was left in Izuku's body quickly disappeared as the warm water ran over Izuku's body. Rolling his neck and shoulder, Izuku was about to relax a bit. But then it was time to start his morning shower routine, which began by applying a ridiculous amount of shampoo to his hair. As it was arguably one of the most important parts of his quirk, Maro and Inko made sure his hair was always clean and healthy. In the beginning, Izuku didn't listen to them and just used normal amounts of shampoo. However, after he noticed how it affected his bullet, Izuku quickly switched to the recommended amount. Once Izuku's hair was covered in shampoo, he let it sit. As he allowed the shampoo to soak into his hair and scalp, Izuku sat about washing the rest of his body, staring at the top and working his way down. Once that task was done, Izuku leaned forward and put his hair under the stream of water. He coaxed the massive amount of shampoo out of his hair by running his fingers through it. With the amount he had used, it took merely 2 minutes for all of the shampoo to be rinsed out. Yet that didn't mean he was finished. He grabbed a silicone hair brush and covered it with shampoo. He then used the brush to directly attack his scalp. After 5 minutes, Izuku rinsed the shampoo out of his hair and then finally turned the water off. Returning the brush to its alcove, Izuku shook the shampoo bottle and saw he still had a quarter bottle left, which was just perfect as he had opened the bottle last week. Izuku used his finger to brush his hair back. Then he threw open the curtains and stepped out onto a bath rug. He grabbed a towel and set about drying off his body, then wrapping it around his waist. The last step of his bathroom routine was to walk over to the sink and use his hairdryer to blow dry his hair, as it was found out early now that using a towel to dry his hair resulted in his hair becoming weaved together and making bad bullets. Izuku took his time drying his hair, as this is why he had to get up early. as it took the most time. Finally, once his hair was dry, Izuku turned off the hairdryer and sent it on the counter. Normally he would be fine with letting his hair fall into its natural position. But with how long his hair was getting, and the evaluation happening, he knew he needed to make it look presentable, so he grabbed a comb and began to style it. Once Izuku found a look he liked, he grabbed a can of hairspray from under the sink. Once his hair was sure to stay in play, Izuku returned the hairspray and then walked out of the bathroom. He hurried down the hallway and walked back into his room. After hanging his towel on a hanger on the back of his door, Izuku dressed himself in a pair of blue jeans with a belt and an All Might t-shirt, as it didn't matter where he went, he was going to wear something All Might. Once he was clothed, Izuku grabbed a pair of socks and headed downstairs. He headed for the kitchen and found that Inko was already making breakfast. He began to make his way to the table, but stopped when a knock came from the front door. "That must be Katsuki. Can you get the Zuzu?" Inko said as she worked on finishing breakfast. Izuku nodded, spun around on the wood floor, and headed to the front door. Already knowing who it was, Izuku opened the door and met Bakugo. He was dressed in jeans similar to Izuku, but was wearing a burnt orange shirt that had a black X going down the back. He had a glint in his eyes as he flashed a grin. "Hey Kaken," Izuku said, moving to the side to allow Bakugo to walk in. "Yeah, die job," Bakugo said, trying to make a nickname stick, as Izuku had done with Kaken. Yet no matter how hard he tried, no nickname stuck, something Bakugo found infuriating. "Sorry, but that's reserved for Sensei Haitomo. Try again," Izuku said, a big smile appearing on his face as he knew what his best friend was trying to do. "Boys, breakfast is ready," Inko called from the kitchen. The two of them quickly walked to the dining room, where Inko had prepared them rice bowls with fish and egg. They all sat down and gave thanks, then began to eat. While they ate, Bakugo turned to Izuku, and with a mouth full of fish asked, "So are you ready to blow whatever test Maro has ready for us today out of the water?" Izuku made sure to swallow the rice in his mouth before speaking. "Yeah, I'm sure we'll be able to pass the tests. I'm just nervous about Prime Minister Renzo and the head of the Hero Public Safety Commission being there." Izuku then took a small drink of milk to wash down a bit of rice and fish. Izuku's comment caught Bakugo by surprise. He didn't know the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of the HPSC were going to be there. This made Bakugo start to choke on his fish, and he had to quickly drink water to get it down. He then had to take a few deep breaths before he could speak. Once he was able to speak, he asked, "The Prime Minister of Japan is going to be there?" "Yeah," Izuku said in an unaffected tone, as if he hadn't just dropped a figurative bomb in Bakugo's lap. Inko froze as she was able to take a bite of fish. She knew the Prime Minister was going to be there today, as Maro had called her last night. Inko gave a small side-eye to Izuku. How had he found out about that? Inko made sure her door was closed, and that Izuku was in bed. "How did you hear about that Zuzu?" Inko asked, then put the fish in her mouth. She likes to think she had a good enough relationship with her son that he would be honest about something like that. Izuku turned to his mother and gave a pleased with himself kind of grin. "I heard Maro talking to Henkido last week. They were discussing his travel arrangement to make sure he got in safely. It was pretty cool to hear about that," Izuku said as he finished his breakfast and walked to the kitchen to put his dish in the sink. "Oi, nerd. You didn't think that it would be nice to inform me of that too?" Bakugo said, shooting an explosive glare at his best friend. Bakugo was smart and confident in his ability, but for something big like that, he would need time to process everything. Izuku skipped through the dining room and headed upstairs to brush his teeth. Before he disappeared from sight, he called out, "What? I just did. A few seconds ago. You're welcome." "That's not allowed. You can't do that." Bakugo huffed. "You could have at least told me yesterday. Then I would have time to mentally prepare myself." "Well, you have 10 minutes to prepare yourself. Then we need to head out," Inko said as she finished her food and washed it down with the rest of her glass of water. She quickly put her plate and utensils in the sink, then grabbed her keys and purse from the counter. Bakugo quickly finished the rest of his breakfast and put his dishes in the sink. He then walked over to the front door to wait, as Izuku finished brushing his teeth. After making sure everything was ready, Inko led the two boys out to the car. Once they were in the car, Inko turned the car on and headed out of the neighborhood. As they drove through town, Izuku and Bakugo talked about what tests they thought Maro would have planned for them. All the while Bakugo kept on harassing Izuku for not telling him about the Prime Minister. Once they arrived, Inko pulled up to the gate and scanned her parking pass. As the gate opened, Inko pulled in and headed to the parking lot that was on the side of the building. After parking, and the car was turned off, the trio got out of the car and walked around to the front. Izuku held the door open for the group, and once inside they walked over to the elevator Inko called the elevator. And once it arrived, they stepped inside, and Izuku hit the button for the 5th floor. They quietly rode the elevator to the 5th floor. Arriving on the 5th floor, they found Maro and his team, along with Madam President of the HPSC and Prime Minister Renzo, waiting for them. Maro looked over from his superiors and flashed a smile at the two boys. No need for them to see how nervous he was about the upcoming tests. Good morning, you two. Today is your first examination to see how your skills and quirks have grown through your training while a part of Project Velocity. Are you ready? Izuku and Bakugo walked out of the elevator, then bowed and said, Yes, sir. For the first stage, you will be showing the limits of your quirks and your control over them. Second stage will be to test your more physical skills, the standard fitness done in middle school. Then you will spar against each to show your skill in judo and karate. Stage 3 will test your mental skills, deductive reasoning, spatial awareness, and overall level of intelligence. Understood, Maro said. Yes, sir. Izuku and Bakugo then turned to Prime Minister Renzo and Madam President and bowed, showing their respect to their superiors. Which just pissed Madam President off. She had come to find flaws in Maro's program, and she could tell the two boys were going to make that hard. Despite being 8 years old, they were acting like well-mannered young men. Katsuki Bakugo, let's begin with you, Maro said as he gestured for Bakugo to step forward. Bakugo walked up to Henkido, who pulled out and then placed a black armband on each of Bikago's wrists. She pressed the buttons on the back and waited until the buttons turned orange. Satisfied with that, Henkido pulled out 2 small silver discs and strapped them around Bakugo's shoulder so the sensors rested on his scapules. The screen behind Maro connects to Bakugo's armbands and shows a flat line on the bottom of a graph. Izuku looked at the graph and saw it was displaying a kilogram per square meter. Bakugo always looked at the screen and realized what it was for. Finally figured out a way for me to test how strong my quirk really is. Yes, Maro said, then turned to Prime Minister Renzo and explained. With young Bakugo's quirk, it was quite the challenge, as we couldn't simply have him hit a punching machine and any sensor we set up, his quirk would destroy. So we went a different direction. The devices in the armbands are similar to electric massage pads. However, instead of sending electrical pulses, it measures them as Bakugo's mind sends them to his hands to activate his quirks, like flexing muscles. This, coupled with the sensors on his shoulders, will get a reading of how much kinetic energy his quirk generates. To make sure the equipment works, Bakugo lit off some small explosions in his hand. The graph on the sensor jumped a bit each time he lit one off. Maro, sir, the sensors appear to be working and are picking up Bakugo's quirk, one of the workers of Project Velocity said. Good. Young Bakugo, let's start with the demonstration. 80% should be fine for now. Want to save a bit for later? Maro said as he folded his arms and waited for Madam President and Prime Minister Renzo to be blown away. Bakugo nodded, signaling Henkido to step back, cracked his knuckles and held his hands out in front of him, his palms wide open. He gained a massive grin and yelled, "Go to hell." He flexed both of his arms and ignited most of his sweat. As Bakugo worked to hold his ground, most of the others had to do the same. Izuku simply stood simple, and Inko had to use her quirk a bit to anchor her feet to the ground. As soon as the initial explosion was over, and as Bakugo waved the smoke from out in front of his face, Maro looked over at the screen and looked over the graph. The entire explosion only lasted for 2 seconds, but the graph began to fall back down to 0. Dismissing this, Maro moved the sensor around until he found the highest point of the graph. He smiled when he found the number and did some quick calculations. Congratulations, young Bakugo, you generated 50,000 kilograms per square meter. That is a little under half the force the average car generates in a crash, while going 95 kilometers per hour. Well done. Impressive display of power, Prime Minister Renzo said as he patted some smoke out of his fur. Though power is nothing without control, what do you have ready to show his level of control? A skill young Bakugo has worked on for some time, Maro said as he reset the graph and pushed a button on the keyboard. Panels in the floor and ceiling opened up, and a red target moved into the room. There were a total of 50 targets, and none were near each other. An exercise young Bakugo helped design. The purpose of this exercise is for him to destroy each target without letting his feet touch the ground. Madam President scoffed and said, "You expect him to fly, yet his quirk shows no means of achieving such a thing." It was such a luscious idea as every quirk had a set skill set. And heroes were idiots for trying something that their quirk obviously couldn't do. Maro frowned a bit, but quickly went back to a neutral expression. He was more than happy to prove Madam President wrong. And since her initial thought over Maro's belief of Bakugo's aerial advantage, he had been waiting to do so. Not without some control. Young Bakugo, you may start when you're ready to. Bakugo nodded, then dropped to the floor to do a few quick push-ups, then got back on his feet. He then took a few running steps. Then, as he was about to cross an invisible line, he placed his hands behind him and lit off an explosion. There was enough force behind it to send him rocketing towards the first target. As Bakugo neared the first target, he reached forwards with his right hand and blasted it apart. With the explosion killing a bit of his momentum, Bakugo began to fall. But before he could hit the ground, he angled an explosion to throw him up and towards the next target. This time, as he reached that target, he kicked it with his foot as he turned around to immediately shoot towards the third target. Madam President did not seem too pleased by this and folded her arm and looked at the ground. However, Prime Minister Renzo was looking over at the graph, which was jumping up every time Bakugo lit off an explosion. This time the sensors were only reading 2,000 kilograms per square meter, more than enough to send Bakugo rocketing around the room. Part of the exercise is not allowing the boy to touch the ground, yet he is moving so quickly that it would be hard to tell if he did so. Prime Minister Renzo said as he tried to follow the blur that Bakugo had become. It was clear Bakugo had done this exercise or something similar to it many times. That part is more based on the honor system. But young Bakugo is a stubborn pride boy and will do his best to meet all aspects of any training exercise. Maro explained as a series of explosions went off, and the graph jumped up each time. A few seconds later, Bakugo hit the floor away from the group and rolled to get back up. You complete that in 3 minutes and 32 seconds. You beat your record by 5 seconds. Henkido said as she clicked a stopwatch. Bakugo smirked as he wiped his hands on his legs and walked over to Izuku, who gave his best friend a small, slow clap. Wow, Izuku said in a sarcastic tone, but still impressed. He knew how much Bakugo valued his quirks and the power of it. So when someone sounded unimpressed by it, Bakugo took it on a personal level. At Izuku's comment, Bakugo began to growl, but since he knew it was all in good fun, he didn't do much. Maro looked over the graph that recorded Bakugo's quirk for a few seconds, then he closed it. He then turned to Izuku and said, "Young Midoriya, now for your turn." Izuku turned and nodded to Maro, who grabbed a black briefcase from the desk and handed it over to Henkido. Henkido took the briefcase from her boss with a nod and then headed over to a spot clear from the group. Izuku followed behind her, already knowing what was in the briefcase. Once they reached the spot, Henkido set the briefcase down on the ground, while Izuku knelt with his right leg down and his left leg up. As Henkido opened the briefcase and began to pull out a device, Izuku rested his left hand on his left knee as he brought his right arm forward and rested into his left hand. Izuku then flexed his right forearm, and his fingers lengthened and then curled and narrowed as they morphed together, taking the shape of a hollow cylinder. His wrist inflated a bit, then narrowed on the forestock of Izuku's weapon. Finally, his forearm expanded out into the shape of the grip and stock of a sniper rifle. Izuku's entire forearm and hand pulsed as it told on a metallic texture and began purple, while at the elbow, the purple color outlined Izuku's veins before disappearing into his bicep. At the sight of Izuku's arm, Madam President looked up and a smirk appeared on her face. It was different from Lady Nagin, but the same nonetheless. Anyone who saw would only be able to see Lady Nagin, and they would call Izuku a villain. And to the malleable mind of an 8-year-old, no matter how much Izuku was told by Inko and Maro, he would eventually begin to believe that voice that was louder. Madam President won't have to do anything. She simply needs to abide by her time and wait. Even if Izuku survived to high school, his skills, his name, and his quirk would force him into the spotlight. Then the world nation, not the whole world, would see him, and see him for who he was. And when the people called for Izuku to be arrested, Madam President would have the perfect hero to take him down. Then Madam President would be able to show the world how evil Izuku was, now corrupt Project Velocity was. Then she would be able to form her hero training program. But for now, she will be patient. And she was nothing if not a patient person. Once Izuku's arm was done transforming, Henkido had finished setting up the device that turned out to be a chronograph. She extended the bottom legs until the dive was level with Izuku's arms. Henkido locked the 2 metal antennas into place and then turned the device on. Once the green light of the screen turned on and the reading appeared, Henkido turned back to Maro. Maro looked down at his laptop, and then flashed a thumbs up to show he was receiving all the data. With everything set, Henkido turned to Izuku and nodded, who nodded back. As Henkido returned to the group, Izuku took a few deep breaths and began to build up the pressure within his forearm. As he continued to slow his breath, Izuku brought his head down to look down at the sight of his rifle. As the range came into view, Izuku smirked as he saw a target downrange, hovering in mid-air. Maro was already testing Izuku. "On your time," Maro said, not noticing that Izuku was already beginning to align his shots. Izuku took a few seconds to align his shot with the target, and then with an exhale, he flexed his entire right arm. Immediately, everyone covered their ears from the bullet breaking the sound barrier. He had learned that while the motion of flexing his right arm was not needed to fire a bullet, Izuku had found when he focused on his right arm, he could fire a bullet at a higher speed. Izuku's arm was kicked back a bit as the bullet went rocketing out of his arm and through the chronograph. Izuku didn't move to see the score as he watched his bullet hit a target Maro had secretly put up on the other side of the building. Once the bullet hit the target, Izuku exhaled as he sat up and began rubbing his right shoulder a bit. While training, his right shoulder had got used to the kickback, but the higher precise shots still left his shoulder feeling a bit sore. Izuku continued to rub his shoulder as he stood up and looked over at Maro, who winked and then looked at his monitor. "You clocked in at 6,000 feet per second. That's around Mach 5. Well done, young Midoriya," Maro said, then pressed some keys on his keyboards, resulting in more targets appearing from the ceiling and floors. "You have 50 targets to hit. The moment you get down to 15, they'll begin to move on your time." Izuku nodded and turned back to all the targets. They were all varying distances from Izuku. It was similar to how Maro had first tested his quirk, but this time it actually meant something. Izuku had 3 years of training now, and it was expected he would do well on the test. As Izuku looked over the target, he thought about all the training he had had and what made this training exercise harder. It was obvious that a normal person would go for the closer targets first, then work their way up to the harder targets that were further away. Normally that would be fine, as Izuku had made that mistake the first time only to learn the last 15 targets would move. After learning that, Izuku trained to be fine hitting the furthest targets first, as there wasn't a need to make it more difficult for him than it needed to be. As Izuku looked over the target, his mind mapped out a pattern for him to follow. A pattern that allowed him to move quickly from target to target, while leaving the 15 closest ones untouched. As his eyes landed on the last target, he stepped forward and raised his right arm out in front of him. Then as it transformed, a bullet was shot out, catching everyone off guard. The bullet flew through the air and hit the first target in the middle of the bullseye. Izuku didn't waste time and moved down and to the right and hit his second target. Another hit. With this monument, Izuku quickly picked off each target, moving a seemingly random pattern. And when he passed a target and didn't hit it, Madam President smirked. To her, it seems Izuku was randomly picking off targets and had missed one as he was moving too quickly and seemed to be more worried about having a good time. She was not the only one to notice this. Prime Minister Renzo had kept a close eye on Izuku as he moved from target to target, and his seemingly random pathing got a lock of acknowledgement. His past in Japan's military had given him the skills to recognize Izuku's pathing. Izuku could have gone for the closest target first and worked his way back, was it not for the last part of the last 15 moving. While it was still unclear what kind of man Izuku would grow up to be, at this moment, Prime Minister Renzo could appreciate the amount of skill Izuku had at such a young age. As Izuku hit the 34th target, he took a small pause in his firing and looked over the last 15 targets. The last 15 targets shook and then began to move around the room, their patterns seeming to be random. Izuku waited for a few seconds, watching the targets' seemingly random movements. Yet Izuku began to see their pattern and smirked as he suddenly fired at one of the moving targets. His shot appeared to go low and to the left, but suddenly the target moved down and to the left, allowing Izuku's shot to hit. Izuku then moved his arm around and then fired 3 bullets and hit 3 more targets. Izuku then paused for 5 seconds, then, without moving his arm, fired 2 bullets. The 2 bullets moved in line with each other, but then the first bullet hit a target. It created a hole that the second bullet used to fly through the target and hit a different target that moved behind the first target. Izuku grinned at his shot, but then noticed the last 8 targets had begun to move more quickly, and their pattern had changed. Izuku looked over at Maro, who kept a straight face. Izuku shook his head. Maro was always looking for new exercises for them to do or making their exercises harder. Izuku moved back to aiming, but this time it took nearly a minute before he took another shot. Then as Izuku tracked the last 7 remaining targets, his vision began to go blurry. Izuku wanted to blink. But then his vision went clear, and his field of vision expanded. He did not have to move from target to keep track of them. His eyes were able to keep track of them all at the same time. Izuku's eyebrow lifted at this sudden vision. He knew he had enhanced vision, which allowed him to see further distances, but make all this information at once. It was new to him, yet Izuku's arm was slowly moving into position. Once his arm stopped moving, Izuku didn't hesitate to take a shot, knowing it was going to go right where it needed to. Yet Izuku was still a little surprised when the bullet hit. But then his arm began moving again. In each position, he fired a shot, and then quickly moved to the next one. As he fired the last bullet, Izuku blinked, and the last few seconds became a bit of a blur. Well done, young Midoriya. You complete the course in 3 minutes and 31 seconds, a new record. Maro said, then looked over at Prime Minister Renzo. I find myself feeling the need to point out that young Midoriya here was able to hit bullseyes on everything. A point that did not need to be made and does not affect my decisions, but one that is greatly appreciated. Prime Minister Renzo said, now I believe you stated the second phase would be showing their physical strength. Yes, as it is standard in Japan, beginning in middle school, yearly every student is required to complete 8 tests without their quirks. These tests are used to mark and track their growth through middle and high school, and to test different strength attributes, strength, speed, flexibility. Though for the sake of time, we'll be removing the endurance test. We'll begin with a 50-meter dash. Maro explained, and then turned to his employees and nodded. They all quickly began setting up the needed equipment for the different testing. For the 50 meters, they placed 2 laser sensors 50 meters apart that would begin a timer when someone broke the first laser and stop the timer when they broke the second one. Once this and more were set up, Maro called the 2 boys up and had them line up at the first laser. Bakugo was first, and when the starting gun went off, he took off down towards the second sensor. He flew down the track and managed to earn himself a 45.4 called out by the machine at the end of the 50 meters. Bakugo cheered a bit as he flashed a grin at his best friend. After Henkito reset the timer, it was Izuku's turn. He walked up to the first laser and looked down the 50 meters to the second laser. He took a deep breath, and when the starting gun went off, Izuku exhaled and pushed off the ground as hard as he could. He shot forwards and quickly got his left foot out in front and, when he landed on it, shifted his weight forwards. This allowed him to keep his speed near his highest, earning him a 44.5. Ha, Kaken, looks like I won that time, Izuku said as he slowed, then turned and walked back to the group. Bakugo had his arms crossed and didn't look too pleased. He wanted to be the best, be number 1. To him that meant being the fastest, the strongest, the best at everything. Don't get cocky, that's only 1 out of 6. Bakugo pointed out. He would make sure to get back and win the next test. Yes, young Bakugo, now it is time for the grip strength, Maro said, walking up to the boy, holding out 2 grip strength testers. You will each grip this device with your right hand, holding it for 3 seconds. You repeated this 3 times, then switched your left hand. Bakugo and Izuku nodded, taking the devices. They held them in their right hand, and Maro said, begin. Bakugo and Izuku pulled down on the handles as hard as they could. After 3 seconds, Maro said, release. Bakugo and Izuku released their devices, and Maro read their number. Bakugo, you got 50 kilograms, Midoriya 75 kilograms. And again. Izuku exhaled and closed his right hand as hard as he took. His knuckles immediately turned white from how hard he was pulling. During the next 3 seconds, Izuku could feel how tight the muscles within his fingers were coiled to push all the power they could. After 3 seconds, Maro said, release. This time Bakugo got 58, and Izuku got 78. Again. Izuku closed his right fist for a 3rd time, and his entire hand turned white as he pulled down the handle. Izuku could feel his hand shake a bit, but he refused to release his finger until time was called. It felt like a whole minute before Maro took them to release. Izuku looked down at the device in their hands and saw he had gotten an 80 while Bakugo had gotten another 58. Young Bakugo, you averaged 55, and young Midoriya, you averaged 77. Now for your left hand, Maro said as Bakugo and Izuku shook their right hands to see the blood flowing again while switching over to their left. After repeating the exercise, Bakugo averaged 51, while Izuku's score did drop to 45. This drop in score earned Izuku a smug smirk from Bakugo. Next was the standing long jump. This time, Izuku went first. he stood at the edge of a sandpit. On your time, Maro said. Izuku did a few short jumps and kicked his legs up to warm them up a bit, then began to swing his arms back and forwards. Then as Izuku swung his arms back, he squatted down, and when he brought his arms back up, he jumped forward as far as he could. In mid-air, Izuku took the pose of an Olympic long jumper, and once he landed in the sandpit, he rolled to keep himself from twisting an ankle. Izuku quickly hopped up on his feet and saw he had jumped a little under 3 meters, well above the average of someone his age and height. However, when Bakugo stepped up and launched himself into the sandpit, he beat Izuku with a 3.4-meter jump. Izuku smiled and dropped a bit as Bakugo stood up and brushed himself off. Bakugo gave his best friend a massive grin, while Izuku reciprocated by sticking his tongue. Their rivalry was stopped as Hankido walked up and handed them 2 gray balls. All right, for this test, you are to throw the balls as far as you can, Maro said, earning him a confused look from Izuku and Bikaw. Neither of them could really believe this was an actual test. It was so simple. And as with everything, Bakugo had to turn it into a competition. Bakugo twirled his ball in his hand as he looked at Izuku and said, "The one that throws it further gets lunch free from the other." "Looks like Aunt Mitsuki is buying me lunch," Izuku said as he lightly tossed the ball up into the air before catching it. He let the ball roll down his arm before popping it back into the air and catching it again. Izuku then stepped forward to a line Hankido had placed on the ground. Izuku stood at the line and then drew his right foot and arm back, while bracing his left foot against the ground. With an exhale, Izuku shifted his weight forward while throwing his right arm forward. At the last second, Izuku whipped his wrist forwards and threw the balls into the air. The ball went soaring through the air, spinning as it arced until it began to slow down and eventually gently falling back down to the ground. 18.3 meters, Hankido said, looking down at her tablet. Bakugo laughed as he stepped forward. In a similar fashion, Bakugo threw the ball into the air, where it had a longer hang time than Izuku's. This made it appear that it would go further, but it suddenly lost all momentum. This caused the ball to fall to the ground and bounced a bit. 17.9 meters. Hankido said as Bakugo's score appeared next to Izuku on her tablet. "Good job, you two. Next is sit-ups," Maro said. Izuku and Bakugo immediately dropped to the floor and got ready. Maro started the timer, and Izuku and Bakugo began to sit down. Bakugo was going faster in the beginning, easily getting in more reps faster than Izuku was. But by the 2.5-minute mark, Bakugo was beginning to slow down, while Izuku kept his steady pace and became too slow to catch Bakugo's count. The moment Maro called 5 minutes, Izuku and Bakugo fell to the ground, gasping for air. Maro gave them a few seconds to catch their breath before asking, "What's your count?" 102. Izuku and Bakugo said at the same time. Maro didn't question it as he had also been counting, and was not all surprised that they had the same score as they trained together and had similar levels of strength. Next was the seated toe touch, and as Izuku was more specialized in Judo, he was able to get 10 centimeters, while Bakugo got 6. Something Bakugo wasn't too pleased with as by his count he was losing overall. Then for the final test, there were repetitive side steps. Both of the boys were told to stand between a pair of cones that were 1.5 meters apart. As the sound of the starting gun, they began to jump back and forth between the cones. After 5 minutes, Maro asked for their count, and they both gave the answer of 245. Impressive young boys, you have done well and are able to score the same as the average middle schooler. Well done. Now for your spar. You have 10 minutes to rest and get change, Maro said, pointing to the changing room behind him. Izuku and Bakugo nodded and walked to the changing room. While they were resting and changing into their martial arts gi, Maro looked over at Madam President, and Prime Minister Renzo asked, "Do you have any thoughts you would like to voice? You have done well training these boys, there's no question about that. However, there was never a question or concern about that. You may not like to believe it is a concern, but no matter how much you deny it, the question of those boys' character will live with them for their life," Madam President said. Maro nodded, then saw Inko's nostril flare and a small glow of green emitting from her eyes. "Madam President, one's character cannot be defined until one has an opportunity to define it. You may not choose to believe that they are different from who you see them as, but there will come a day when your concern is no longer understandable." Maro turned to his monitor, but Madam President wasn't finished. "You clearly do not understand what you are doing here. Izuku Midoriya, the more you train him, the bigger of an issue he will become in the future. When you learn that, it will be too late to fix it. Maro just shook his head as he continued to look over all the data from the test. He glanced over at Henkido and whispered, "Move to Mrs. Midoriya and stop her from doing anything stupid." Henkido nodded, but began to move. Maro then turned to Madam President and said, "That may well be true, but I believe on that day, it will be you who learns something." Madam President huffed as she walked up to Maro. "You forget your place, as your position over Project Velocity has been and can again be revoked. You might be able to pass the benchmark, train those boys into heroes, but in the end you will fail at what you set out to do. Because you chose the wrong person. Tsutsumi was not as great as you thought." Maro wasn't fazed at Madam President's outburst, nor that Henkido had to retain Inkojin. "Henkido, I believe it would be better for everyone, especially Mrs. Midoriya, if you escort her out of the building for some time being." Henkido nodded as she began pulling Inko towards the elevator door. As they got close, Henkido noticed Madam President's blazer beginning to glow. Henkido quickly covered Inko's eyes, and the glow disappeared as Henkido used her hip to hit the button. Luckily, the elevator quickly opened. Henkido dragged Inko to the elevator and said, "You shouldn't have done that." Madam President might not have noticed. The Prime Minister most certainly did. Inko continued to struggle, but with Madam President out of her line of sight, there was nothing she could do to the wretch of a woman. And with Henkido's strength quirk, Inko was not going to be able to break out. Inko took a deep breath and stopped struggling, signaling to Henkido that she could be released. "I know fully well what they're capable of. But I can't see or talk to the love of my life. My sister is in jail, and they're talking as if my son belongs with her. A boy I have lied to every day. Let him grow up in a household that bases on a fountain of lies. If he ever does learn the truth, I'm not afraid of him becoming a villain. But he'll be crushed all the same. I'll lose any trust he has in him. Then prove them wrong, as Maro hopes you can. Build enough trust with your son, that if he does learn, he'll still come to you in his hour of need." Henkido said as she put a hand on Inko's shoulder. "What?" Inko said, looking at Henkido. "Maro approached me a few days ago, and asked if it was a wise idea to allow you to come along. He knew that Madam President was going to bring up your sister. She had in every conversation for the last 2 years. And he knew that you weren't going to like what she had to say. So he approached me and asked if I thought it was a good idea to bring you, or if your friend should have been the one to bring the boys into for their exam." Henkido said. "What did you say?" Inko asked. "I told him that it shouldn't be a question, as you are one of the most level-headed people I meet, and have the honor of knowing. You might like what Madam President says about your sister and your son, but you should know of all people what she is trying to do," Henkido said. Inko took a deep breath and was quiet for a bit. When she spoke, she said, "Thank you, Henkido, for stopping me from ruining my son's life. I appreciate the faith, but I believe it would be best if I was outside for the rest of the exam." Henkido nodded as the elevator dinged and the door opened to the first floor. Inko walked out, and then Henkido called out, "They'll be fine, they just have the spar left." The door closed before Inko could question Henkido. "Then what about Phase 3? Oh, Maro, you still think you can play that trick?" Once inside the changing room, Izuku and Bakugo went to their separate rooms to change. They quickly stripped out of their normal clothes and into their martial arts gi. Bakugo had to redo his top, as he had accidentally put it on inside out. Once Bakugo corrected his mistake and tied his belt, he stepped out and found Izuku leaning against the wall. Izuku looked up from the ground and said, "What took you so long?" "Had to rehydrate. Target practice took a bit out of me," Bakugo said, holding up an empty water bottle. He then crushed it flat and then tossed it into the trash bin that was on the other side of the room. The two of them watched as the water bottle fell into the trash bin in nothing but net style. Izuku laughed, causing Bakugo to lightly punch him in the arm. "Shut up. I wanted to make a good impression." "I figured since I did the same," Izuku said, clenching his right hand and then releasing it. The numb feeling in his hand he had since his first shot was still there, but was starting to disappear. Bakugo noticed, but didn't say anything. Without anything else to hold them back from facing their next test, the two boys walked over to the door and headed to the training area. As they walked up to the group, they found a section-off area that had been covered with practice mats. On the practice mats was a white tape circle marking the boundaries of the fighting arena. As they walked up to the group, Izuku readjusted the shoulder of his martial gi, while Bakugo tightened his blue belt. Through their training, they had both received blue belts with a black dash in karate and judo, making them proud of their achievements. Maro looked up his laptop and over at the boys. He gave a small smile to them, then motioned them to follow him. Maro led the boys over to the practice mats, and overstepping onto one, he turned around and said, "The rules of this match are simple. It will be a 10-minute round. However, for the first 5 minutes, you are not allowed to use your quirks. We want to have a show of your martial arts skills. Then if you reach the 5-minute mark, you will then be allowed to use your quirks." Understood. Izuku and Bakugo both answered with a nod. As it was the normal rule they fought with whenever they spared each other. Sensei Hitomo had actually been the one to suggest the rule set, stating that it was good to have the skills to fight with, and without their quirks, while also gaining the skill of knowing how to switch fighting styles mid-fight. "Good. Are you ready?" Maro said and gestured for the boys to get in position. Izuku and Bakugo responded by moving to opposite sides of the circular arena. Izuku jumped in place for a bit and rolled his shoulders, while Bakugo cracked his knuckles and rolled his neck. With both of them now being ready, they turned and bowed to Maro. They then turned to each other and bowed. Maro looked behind Izuku and Bakugo, both of them looking ready. Maro then took a step forward and held out his right arm. He shot one last glance at each boy, then quickly brought down his arm as he yelled, "Fight!" Izuku and Bakugo initially waited for a second, to give Maro a chance to step back. Once Maro had stepped back, everyone expected Izuku and Bakugo to throw themselves at each other. Yet for the next 20 seconds, the boys just looked at each other. Through their fights and spars, they learned how each other fought, how they threw punches, how they attacked with kicks, but most importantly how they opened their fights. Izuku and Bakugo didn't break eye contact, where to see how the other chose to fight. Bakugo kept his eye on Izuku. In the past, whenever they had sparred with quirks, Izuku was usually the victor, despite Bakugo's quirk being better suited for close-quarters combat. Using his enhanced eyesight, Izuku was able to keep up with his speed and dodge his attack, though the same could be said without quirks. As Izuku's quirk suited for CQC, he had to train in 2 different skills. His focus was split, allowing Bakugo to focus more heavily on CQC and become more proficient more quickly. This meant Bakugo's chance of winning would decrease the longer the battle went on. That meant Bakugo knew that if he wanted to increase his odds of winning, then he would need to end the fight before the 5-minute mark. With that, Bakugo broke the stalemate and rushed forwards, pushing so hard against the mat that it would have flown back if it wasn't anchored to the ground. Bakugo easily cleared the entire arena, yet Izuku already had his hands up ready to block Bakugo's opening attack. Bakugo had his hands ready to attack, but when he got in range, he suddenly dropped down and tripped to sweep Izuku's legs out from under him. His attack nearly connected, but Izuku managed to jump up and flip over Bakugo. Landing behind Bakugo, Izuku used his momentum to roll under Bakugo's follow-up roundhouse kick. Izuku rolled to the middle of the arena, where he popped up. As Izuku turned around, he had to raise his left arm to block Bakugo's right crosshook. Izuku smirked and jabbed at Bakugo's gut, but Bakugo deflected the attack. He then doubled down on breakthrough Izuku's block. He began to lean forward, even putting his left arm into pushing against Izuku's left arm. This forced Izuku to bring his right arm up and match Bakugo's force. In this power struggle, they locked eyes again and Bakugo began to yell and apply more pressure on Izuku, as he saw in Izuku's eyes that he wasn't going to give up. He was going to be the #1 hero in the world, and that started by winning this match. Yet as Bakugo continued to increase the pressure, Izuku just matched Bakugo's force with a straight face. But unfortunately in this power struggle, Bakugo had the height advantage, which meant not only was Bakugo pushing Izuku back, but also down. This was forcing Izuku to not only work against Bakugo, but against gravity as well. As the power struggle continued, Izuku's feet slowly slid back, and the muscle within his arms and legs strained against Bakugo's attack. Izuku felt heat in his legs as he struggled to keep his ground. Izuku began to grimace against the pain when he suddenly felt his knee hit the ground. With Bakugo and gravity, Izuku was losing the battle of leverage, making it clear Izuku wasn't going to win a prolonged power struggle. He had to think of something quick, or the rest of his body would join his knee on the ground. Suddenly Izuku got a wicked idea, that if he succeeded in it, it would throw Bakugo off guard long enough for Izuku to reclaim some ground in the fight. He just needed to time it perfectly. Lucky timing was Izuku's speciality. Izuku shoved as hard as he could against Bakugo, then let himself fall to the ground. As expected, Bakugo was thrown off guard by the sudden lack of resistance. He began to fall forward and over Izuku. However, Izuku was waiting for him. The moment Izuku's back hit the ground, he brought his right foot up and held it in place for Bakugo to land on. And the moment Bakugo's chest collided with Izuku's foot, Izuku brought his right leg in and leaned back. As Bakugo cleared Izuku's head, Izuku pushed his right leg as hard as he could to send Bakugo flying to the edge of the arena. As Bakugo crashed and rolled to a stop, Izuku got to his feet. Izuku turned around and looked over at his best friend, who was taking deep breaths, showing that Izuku's attack had forced the air out of his lungs. And while Izuku would have normally allowed his friend to catch his breath, so they could continue, this wasn't a spar. So Izuku launched himself at his opponent. Izuku landed right in front of Bakugo, and brought his right arm up to bring it down on Bakugo's neck. But Bakugo must have been more recovered than he appeared as he easily caught the attack. Izuku drew his arm back in, and then brought his right leg up to do a front kick. Yet before Izuku could kick his foot out, Bakugo shot his hand up and shoved Izuku's knee back to the ground. Yet this is what Izuku was hoping for, as Bakugo's arm went shooting up past his chest from the recoil. Izuku quickly shifted his weight to right leg, and brought his left leg up to kick Bakugo in the gut. Izuku felt Bakugo's right side cave inwards from the attack. The air in his lungs was forced out as Bakugo went flying to the side and hit the mat, only stopping a foot away from the edge of the arena line. He was coughing and trying to catch his breath. He slowly got his knee. He hadn't been able to fully catch his breath, and Izuku's kick was making it harder as his diaphragm was threatening to go into spasm, and that would take him out of his fight. Luckily, Bakugo finally managed to get his breathing under control, and just in time to see Izuku could rocket towards him. Bakugo raised his hands to defend as Izuku got in close and went for a headlock, intending to choke Bakugo in submission. However, Bakugo used both of his hands to knock Izuku's arm away from his throat. Then with the back of his hand slugged Izuku across the jaw. Izuku took a step, more of a surprise than pain, but that gave Bakugo the chance to go once again on the attack. Having practiced with Bakugo for the last 2 years, Izuku knew Bakugo's default routine. First, a sidekick to Izuku's rib, which he blocked using his forearm, though it made his arm scream out in pain. Seeing this, Bakugo quickly brought his foot back down and brought his arm back to do a strong punch. Through his fuzzy vision, Izuku saw the punch coming, so he took the chance to end Bakugo's routine early. Izuku ducked his head to the left and then took a step forward. This allowed Izuku to get in close again and thrust his palm into Bakugo's sternum, right where he had kicked Bakugo's earlier. Bakugo's chest heaved backwards, and what little air that was in his lung was forced out again. As his brain registered that the blood within his body was not getting the proper level of oxygen, that threw Bakugo into a bit of a panic. In this panic, Bakugo threw a haymaker, which Izuku backflipped away from. Izuku then handspring to push him further away, in hopes of using the distance to give him time to also recover, which he was able to get. So as soon as he landed back on his feet, Izuku closed his eyes and shook his head to clear his vision up. Once his head was clear, Izuku opened his eyes to see Bakugo rushing forward. Clearly he had taken the break in a fight to get this air back into his body, which Izuku had taken into account. But it seems Bakugo had been able to recover faster than Izuku was hoping for. Bakugo stopped only a foot away from Izuku and brought his right foot up with the plan of bringing it back down hard onto Izuku's shoulder. Izuku managed to roll to the side and dodge the attack, but Bakugo was hot on his heels with another sidekick to Izuku's ribs. Izuku knocked the sidekick away, then Bakugo threw a punch. They began to exchange punches as both of them threw them, but neither was able to land a hit. Bakugo would throw a right hook, and Izuku would block it and counter with a kick to which Bakugo stepped back from. Izuku would go for a grapple, but Bakugo would slip out of his grip and go for a leg sweep, and Izuku would jump over. Their coordinated dance of a fight continued until Bakugo came in hard for a karate chop to Izuku's neck, and Izuku punched Bakugo's arm out of the way. This gave Izuku a big enough opening to take a small step forward, and then launch forward with another front kick. Expecting Izuku to do the same trick as before, Bakugo caught Izuku's ankle, stopping Izuku's attack and forcing Izuku to hop on one foot. Izuku tried to pull his foot out, but Bakugo kept it in a vice grip. Bakugo looked up from Izuku's foot and smiled. He then took a step forward and shoved Izuku's ankle in an attempt to make Izuku call backwards. However, Izuku hopped backwards and managed to keep his balance. Bakugo was going to try against, but then he saw something in Izuku's eyes. Izuku thought he would have fallen over, but when he was able to keep his balance, he looked Bakugo in the eyes and smiled. Izuku lifted his right fist, and then wiggled his index finger in a no-no motion. Bakugo's smile dropped as he realized what was about to happen. Izuku jumped up with his left leg, and using Bakugo's hold as a pivot, Izuku spun around and kicked Bakugo in the side of the head. As Bakugo's head was whipped to the side, and then he fell to the ground, he cursed Sensei Hitomu for teaching Izuku that move. It was fine that Izuku knew it, and was able to do it, while Bakugo typically landed on his butt. What made Bakugo pissed about the move was the fact Izuku found the need to use it every time he could. Bakugo's face hit the mat, but he wasn't ready to give up. He fought through the pain in his head, punching the mat. This flash of anger gave him the clarity through the pain to get his knees under him. As Bakugo raised his head, he saw Izuku coming in with a right karate chop. Instincts taking over, Bakugo reached up and grabbed Izuku's wrist, stopping the attack. Then using Izuku's monument, Bakugo grabbed Izuku's entire arm and lifted him to the ground. Izuku began to scream as Bakugo then slammed him into the ground. Izuku groaned as he hit the ground and Bakugo kicked him in the gut. Izuku went flying from the kick and landed on the other side of the mat, rolling when he hit the ground. Bakugo laughed as he saw Izuku begin to cough. "That's for kicking the air out of my lungs." Izuku continued to cough as he got to his hands and knees. He forced himself to stop coughing and take a deep breath. As air filled his lungs, a sharp pain exploded out of his chest. This caused Izuku's eyes to go a bit wide and a small "oh" escaped his lips. Bakugo laughed as he jumped up onto his feet and rushed forward. Bakugo's speed didn't let up until he was ramming his knees into Izuku's chest. Izuku was thrown back down onto the mat, allowing Bakugo to grab Izuku's right arm and twist it, while he pressed down on Izuku's chest with his foot. "Are you done yet?" Bakugo asked as he put more weight on Izuku's chest. With his bruised chest and the weight from Bakugo's knee, Izuku nearly bit his tongue out of the pain. As Izuku continued to fight through the pain, he suddenly tasted blood in his mouth. This told Izuku Bakugo's kick to his gut had caused more damage than he had first thought. "And that's 5 minutes," Maro said, drawing Bakugo's attention. Izuku spat out some blood and said, "No." Izuku then flexed his entire right arm and smoke came off of his forearm. Bakugo noticed, and he began to release Izuku. However, Izuku was faster, and his forearm transformed. It extended out, and the barrel rammed itself into Bakugo's chin. With the speed and force behind the attack, Bakugo was lifted into the air. Yet Bakugo was completely caught off guard, and he was able to light off some explosions to coordinate himself in the air. This allowed him to flip around and land properly on his feet. Once Bakugo landed on the mat, he almost took a knee as his body screamed from the pain from Izuku's attack, as it had felt like he had been punched by a cinder block. He looked up and knew he should yield. Izuku was already back on his knees and had his weapon trained on Bakugo. Bakugo knew he wasn't faster than a speeding bullet. The fastest he had ever gone using his explosion was 56 kilometers per hour. And Bakugo knew he wouldn't be able to beat Izuku to the punch. With his enchanted eyesight, Izuku's reflexes were some of the fastest, so if Bakugo tried to launch himself towards his friends, Izuku would be able to react, and that would give Bakugo even less time to dodge the bullet. And Izuku knew this as he began to smirk. "Your move taken," Izuku said, as his arm made an audible loading sound of a gun being cocked. A sound that was in no way needed for his quirk to actually work. Izuku just used the sound for intimidation. Bakugo knew Izuku had the advantage, but his pride would not allow him to surrender. Yet no matter how he attacked, Izuku would be able to follow his movement. Izuku and his damn eyesight. Bakugo then smiled. He didn't look away from Izuku, but pointed his arms down to the ground. "You think flying was the only move I've worked on? Smoke grenade." Bakugo lit explosions from his hands. It was a gamble as Bakugo had been able to get it working like he wanted it to. Yet he wanted to win, and if he had to take a gamble, then he would. So instead of a large explosion, Bakugo folded the explosions in on themselves, resulting in a cloud of smoke engulfing him. Izuku raised an eyebrow at the smoke screen. He had talked with Bakugo about being able to create a smoke screen, but he hadn't seen his friend trying the idea out. Yet Izuku and Bakugo knew the purpose of a smoke screen, so he kept his eyes trained on the entire smoke cloud. Izuku's eyes darted around. Yet for the next few seconds, nothing happened. Izuku didn't hear any explosion or see the flash of ones. Yet Izuku didn't look from the smoke screen, knowing his friend was cooking something up. Then suddenly Bakugo came flying out of the smoke cloud. He had his right hand primed to blast Izuku's right in the face. Izuku's eyes went a little wide as he had no time to dodge. Bakugo was blocking forwards and would have been able to easily cover the side, meaning the only way Izuku would do was to go backwards. So that's what he did. Izuku began to step backwards, but then his right buckled. The strain of kicking Bakugo so much had caught up to Izuku's. The pain made Izuku's right knee fold and Izuku fell to the ground. Izuku's back hit the mat, and just in time, Izuku looked up and saw Bakugo flying over him. It was as if time slowed down as Izuku and Bakugo locked eyes. Bakugo began to say something, but then time resumed, and he went flying over the mark off the area of the mat. Katsuki Bakugo has left the circle, and thus is disqualified, Maro said. Bakugo quickly used his quirk to stop himself from flying into a wall, while Izuku rolled up and slowly picked himself up. He didn't put much weight on his right leg, but also tried not to show that his leg was in pain. He did a good job of it as only Bakugo, Maro and Inko noticed Izuku's discomfort. Izuku and Bakugo walked back to the main area, with Maro right behind Izuku in case he fell again. Once the trio was around the main group, Maro turned to the boys and said, "Well done both of you. Now I would like you to analyze each other's fighting styles." Izuku and Bakugo thought about how the other had fought for a bit, then Bakugo answered first. Izuku was going for more speed than power. His attacks were quick, but when they landed they didn't do much damage. He was aiming for the same thing over and over again, slowly breaking down my defenses and sapping my stamina. So when the timer hits 5 minutes, I would be exhausted, putting him in a position to end the fight with his quirk. Maro nodded, then turned to Izuku. And how did Bakugo fight? He went for more of an aggressive approach, hoping to end the fight before quirks were allowed. With my enhanced eyesight, I've been able to follow his movement, even with him using his explosion to increase his speed. It was clear from the force behind the power struggle. A prolonged fight was never in his mind. Izuku said, "Thank you, you twos." Maro then turned to Prime Minister Renzo and Madam President. "Do you have any other questions you would like to ask?" Madam President shook her head, but Prime Minister Renzo stepped forward. "It's wonderful to see that such young kids with quirks like yours are taking the time to prepare themselves to serve our nation in the future. Your demonstrations today have done well showing your quirk. But demonstrations do not tell a full story, so I have a few questions." "Midoriya, I'll start with you." Izuku nodded and the Prime Minister continued. "With your ammunition, how much you can hold?" "Right now, sir, I can hold 60 bullets." Izuku spoke. "Your file states your quirk only works with your right arm. Have you ever tried with your left?" Prime Minister Renzo asked. It was a more powerful version of Lady Nagant's. But more powerful didn't simply mean more force. It could be more versatile. "No, sir. A question I had with I first granted more quirk. But I am only able to transform my right arm," Izuku said, and Prime Minister Renzo nodded, and then turned to Bakugo. "Bakugo, you seem to have a great understanding of your quirk, and the difficulty that it takes to control it. Is there a skill you hope to one day gain from your quirk?" "At the moment, sir, I have nothing new planned. I plan on practicing my ability to fly and my smoke grenade. As I near perfecting those, I will begin to think of new abilities," Bakugo said with a bow. "Good, now a question for both of you," Prime Minister Renzo said, then decided it was time to ask the most important question. The one that would define the boys and their future careers. What inspires you to become heroes? "We wish to be heroes like All Might, saving people with a smile," both of the young boys said, flashing the biggest smiles they could. President Renzo had to hold back a laugh at this, and to do so he nodded and then said, "I have no further questions. Thank you for having me, Maro." "Madam President, Prime Minister, thank you for joining us today," Maro said. Prime Minister Renzo gave a slight bow to Maro, and then he and Madam President turned and walked to the elevator. Once the elevator closed, Maro gestured for Inko to come over. Maro then dropped a whisper. "Good job, you two. Now get home and rest for the next week. Young Midoriya, get an ice pack on that knee of yours." Izuku titled his head. "I know then you're not trying to put too much weight on it, and the way it folded wasn't too natural. I suspect it came from throwing Bakugo with your leg. Now, get changed." Bakugo took Izuku's right arm and helped him to the changing rooms. Then Bakugo changed back into regular clothes, while Izuku just switched out his shirt. Bakugo then helped Izuku out of the changing room and over to the elevator. Inko joined them in the elevator and rode down. After dropping Bakugo off, Inko helped Izuku inside and onto the couch. As Izuku grabbed the TV remote to turn on the next, Inko headed into the kitchen, where she grabbed an ice pack, and after thawing it out a bit, Inko brought it to Izuku. Izuku grabbed his right leg with his hands and brought it up to rest it on the ottoman. Inko then handed Izuku the ice pack, which he took and gently laid it over his knee. Inko watched as her son let out a slow exhale as he leaned back into the couch. Inko looked down at Izuku's knee, and she felt worried to enter her heart. No mother enjoys seeing their children hurt. Inko had to let out her slow breath as she felt herself start to get worked up, and she ended her train of worry with the thought that at least Izuku's knee wasn't broken. While injuries were common during training within Project Velocity, the most common being bruises and sprained joints. Every once in, and while a joint was fully dislocated or a bone was broken. Yet if Inko was getting this worried about a sprained knee, she didn't know how she would react to a worse injury. Hopefully, she would be able to remember in the moment that it had come from Bakugo, and that it wasn't on purpose. After their first evaluation, Izuku and Bakugo took Prime Minister Renzo's praise to heart and used it as motivation to train harder. They wanted to become the best pro heroes that the world had ever seen. At the time, they were only supposed to train on the weekends, only sparring under Sensei Hitomu and Sensei Hakaku's supervisor. However, with their excellent grades and work ethic, Izuku and Bakugo often found themselves bored most evenings. They had first tried to fill their boredom with chores around the house. Yet they were so efficient that it didn't stay a solution for very long, and they were back to square one. Izuku and Bakugo tried to entertain themselves with board games or only activating, but that didn't last any longer than the chores. It was on a Wednesday when Bakugo suggested that they forego waiting until the weekend and just spar in their backyard. Bakugo's backyard had enough room for them to easily move around as they were spared. As Mitsuki and Masaru retired to their room after dinner, the boys were quiet enough that they had a chance to get away with it. Izuku was hesitant in the beginning, but after 2 hours of staring up at his room's ceiling as he lay on his bed, he tried to fill his mind with something to do. But needless to say, Izuku caved. With a sigh, he hopped off his bed and headed into the living room. He called Bakugo and informed him he was coming over. After grabbing a jacket and slipping into a pair of shoes, Izuku called out to Inko that he was leaving the apartment. He walked down the stairs of the apartment complex and pointed himself in the direction of Bakugo's house. He then let his feet carry him the distance, thinking about how much trouble he could get into when his mother found out about this. Walking to the other end of the neighborhood, Izuku found himself walking up the driveway of the Bakugo estate. He walked up to the door and knocked. He only had to wait a short time as Bakugo was quick to answer the door. He was wearing his normal black shirt with a skull on it and a pair of cargo shorts, but he had sparring gloves and knee pads on. He tossed Izuku a pair that Izuku easily caught. As Izuku slipped them on, he followed Bakugo through the house and to the backyard. Bakugo had set aside a pair of water bottles on the porch. Bakugo and Izuku walked off the porch and into the grass and did a quick warm-up. After warming up, Izuku slipped his shoes on and Bakugo said, "So common sense. No quirks?" "Obviously," Izuku said as he tossed his shoes onto the porch. With that decided, Izuku and Bakugo shifted into their stance and Bakugo started the fight. He lunged forward and tried to thrust his palm into Izuku's chest. Izuku easily sidestepped the attack and landed a jab against his friend's side. Bakugo backed off before Izuku could unleash a combo. The two of them stared each other down before continuing their spar. And they are about to get away from it for the most part. Even with all the strikes they landed, the noise was cushioned by the gloves they wore. With the grass and soft dirt under their feet, they were about to move around without making too much noise. Yet it all came to an end when Mitsuki found them. She had come downstairs, taking a break from her yoga to get a glass of water. They had almost gone away with their spar until Mitsuki was putting her glass into the sink and heard a hard thud noise. She quickly looked up and out the window, only to see her son lying on Izuku's back, pinning him to the ground. As Mitsuki took in the sight, fire began to fill her eyes. All the angry management lessons she had been to, all the counseling Inko made her go to, it was all forgotten. Mitsuki quickly looked around for some kind of large bowl and came across a mixing bowl. She filled it with ice-cold water from the sink. Once it was full, she carried it over to the back door, which she opened with her hip. Mitsuki then walked over the porch and across the yard to the mess of boys. Izuku spotted her as she walked up, and he tried to warn Bakugo. But with Bakugo on his back, Izuku wasn't about to get the air to form words. Mitsuki stood behind her son's back. Though fear was evident in Izuku's eyes, she held no mercy. So without a warning, she dumped the ice-cold water over her son. The water hit Bakugo's spiky hair, and it immediately dropped down. The water continued to pour over Bakugo, soaking his shirt and pants, then finally pouring over Izuku. Bakugo gasped for air as he jumped off Izuku, and finally felt the anger coming from behind him. He jumped away. Bakugo turned around ready to fight. But when he met the eyes of his mother, he wasn't even ready to defend himself. He wanted nothing more than to run away, and he could see the same look in Izuku's eyes as he slowly picked himself up from the ground. What the hell, on God's green F432 KNG Earth, made you think it was a good F432 KNG idea? You know that you're only allowed to spar under your sensei's watch. And what's so damning is you thought you could get away with it. What the hell were you doing about the bruise you were going to get from this? Did you think you would be able to hide them from us? Were your F432 KNG mothers? Or not B321 Ches 1? Mitsuki yelled for the whole block to hear as her face got red from screaming. Izuku and Bakugo looked at each other. They hadn't heard Mitsuki yell like that in a while. Mitsuki then growled at the boys and pointed the bowl at the door. Now get your Saria *** inside and dry yourselves off. Izuku, I'll be having a phone call with your mother in the meantime. And if you think I'm going strong on you, then you haven't seen Inko on a bad day. With that, Bakugo and Izuku military marched back inside and to the nearest bathroom to dry themselves off. They then sat in the living room while Mitsuki called Inko and stayed within earshot of the boys. While Inko never swore the boys could hear it in her voice, she was beyond pissed. 5 minutes later, Inko was over and was talking in person with Mitsuki. Mitsuki wanted to punish the boys and bar them from going to Project Velocity so they couldn't train. But Inko just said that the boys would just try the same thing again, but be smarter about it. And doing this showed how serious they were about their training and how they wanted to become better. So Inko proposed that as long as the boys were able to keep up with their grades, they would be able to spar throughout the weeks. On the basis that either of the mothers had to be present for the fights, and they were allowed to spar at any time for any reason. After Izuku and Bakugo agreed to the terms, Inko took Izuku home. That Saturday, Maro wasn't too happy hearing about their spar. But in his eyes, it was easy to see he was proud of how serious they were taking their training. In the coming years, Izuku would often walk to Bakugo's house, and they would train. Training would usually last until dinner, after which Izuku would head home. A few times Izuku and Bakugo would continue sparring until late in the evening, at which point Mitsuki would shoot them with a Nerf gun. She eventually got good enough to easily nail them in the head from the porch. And then she would drive Izuku home. Yet no matter how often Izuku and Bakugo sparred, their grades never dropped. As they grew up, they began to find other things to find in their free time. So if they weren't training, they were doing community service. It began with picking up the trash within the local parks and keeping them clean. But as they got older, they began doing volunteer work. They volunteered at shelters and food banks or helped families within the community move in or out of their homes. Then when they turned 12, Maro started the pair of boys on weight training. It didn't take them for them to get bored of the repetitive motion of the exercises. They tried to listen to music or watch a TV show while they exercised. But that didn't last too long. So Izuku and Bakugo began looking for something new. After a month of searching, Izuku came across Takoba Beach. The article he came across stated the beach had been a well-used vacation spot. But over the years, trash began to pile. It got so bad the beach was more of a landfill than anything else. After forwarding the article to Bakugo, the pair of boys biked down to the beach on Friday and overlooked it. It didn't take long for them to decide it was perfect for them. They would be able to train their body while carrying weight around and be able to clean up the beach at the same time. After investing in a box of gloves, the boys set about cleaning up the beach. They began with the lighter, smaller stuff. But within 2 weeks they had worked until they worked up to the heavier stuff, such as old refrigerators, ovens, freezers, washing machines, and dishwashers. Some were big enough that they had to work together to lift them. With the smaller items, they were about to throw them into the trash bin. But with the larger items, Izuku and Bakugo would carry them to the sidewalk. Leaving most on the edge of the parking lot, they would send a text message to the police officer. They had become good associates with that. There was more trash to be picked up. It was exhausting work, making the boys always sleep hard those days. But it wasn't long before they began to see the result of their hard work. And every time either of them was shirtless, and they looked in a mirror, they were reminded why they were so happy to have a chance to train to become heroes. Then came the missions. They were simple missions to train the boys in different aspects of hero activity. The missions were usually tailing a person who would be a member of Project Velocity in disguise. And with each mission, there would be different parameters Izuku and Bakugo had to meet, such as not losing their target, or losing their target then finding them again, keeping a 50-meter distance, or being right behind their targets. With every mission, Izuku and Bakugo's skills in tracking and stealth grew. Maro tracked their progress and knew that with each new mission, a new challenge needed to be added. Each one had to be more difficult than the previous one, going further and further to test the limits of the boys, all to help them become pro heroes in the future. Then one day when they were 13, they received a mission that went a bit sideways. Izuku was hanging upside down, with his rifle aimed at a target 500 yards away. He was hanging upside down as his right leg was tied in a rope that suspended him 30 feet in the air. So while Izuku focused on his shot, he had to make sure his feet didn't slip. or he would fall, and Maro conveniently forgot to add padding to the floor. Izuku looked away from his rifle and up at his foot. The rope had begun to dig a bit into his pants leg, but not enough to cause any harm. Izuku wiggled his toes a bit, but his foot didn't move. Satisfied that he wasn't going to fall, Izuku dropped his head and closed his left eye to align his shot again. With the target 500 yards out, it should have been impossible to see it. But with his enhanced eyesight, to Izuku the target might as well be 50 yards away. Izuku's vision swayed back and forth as he focused on the middle ring of the target. He moved his barrel half a degree to the right and a little up, then was perfectly aligned to the bullseye. Izuku opened his off eye and took a small breath. His entire body was relaxed, and he could hear Bakugo's explosions going off in the distance. The taste of the air was stale from the AC as it created a small breeze. Izuku flexed his right arm, and a gunshot rang through the building. Izuku watched as the purple and green bullet whizzed through the air and went into the target, half an inch from the bullseye. Izuku sighed as he had missed the center. His right arm fell as he relaxed it and let gravity take over. He had trained a lot in the last week to improve his aim in odd positions, but it was clear there was some improvement that could be made. You're half an inch left, but impressive from that distance and position. Maro's voice came through an earpiece in Izuku's ear. Better than you shot last week. You've improved greatly. Now untie yourself and head over. I've got another mission for you and Bakugo. Over the last 8 years, Maro had poured his head and soul into training Izuku and Bakugo. While Maro saw Izuku as the frontrunner, he knew he couldn't play favorites, so when he could, he personally trained the boys. And not once during those times had he broken his promise to Inko. He didn't mention Lady Nagant or her name as Kainet Tsutsumi, nor did Izuku ask questions about his quirk. He believed the lie was an odd quirk combination between Hisoshi's fire breath and Inko's telekinesis. A lie that was easy to believe as Bakugo's quirk had the same result. A perfect combination of his parents' quirk. On it, sir, Izuku said as he transformed his arm back. Izuku then hauled his upper body to his right foot. He began to untie the knot that held the rope from around his leg. It took a bit as the knot had gotten tighter than Izuku had expected. Once he had undone the knot, his foot quickly slipped out, forcing Izuku to quickly grab the rope so he didn't fall to the ground. Izuku then gracefully climbed down the rope and was soon on the ground. Izuku took a bit to stretch his body out, kicking his right leg out to pop his knee and ankle, then stretching his right arm out to get the numb feeling to go away. Once his body was fully relaxed, Izuku grabbed his jacket, threw it over his shoulder, then began walking back to where Maro was waiting for them. This time you've got a high-value target, Maro said. Keywords for, don't lose the target and stay within 15 meters of them. They're believed to be a higher-up of a Quirk drug ring, and recently they've had frequent meetings with their boss. One such meeting is happening today 2 hours from now at 6 o'clock. However, we don't know the location, so you'll need to follow this person. Maro pulled out a photo of a disguised HPSC worker, wearing a light gray jacket with a black baseball cap, and put it on the table. Tag them and follow them to the meeting. After the meeting is over, call me, and we'll talk about how well you did. Where are we supposed to find this man to follow him? Bakugo asked. Our source says he's a regular at the local KFC and has dinner there every Saturday. That's where you'll find him, Maro said. Izuku and Bakugo looked at the photo of the disguised HPSC worker and memorized the clothing. Once they had the photo memorized, they looked at Maro and nodded, who nodded back. After a quick change and some refreshments, the two boys left to fulfill their mission. Hopping onto their bikes, they rode them to the local KFC. After locking their bikes to the bike rack, the two of them headed in. Bakugo ordered a spicy chicken sandwich meal, while Izuku ordered a drink and a side of fries. After receiving their food, they walked over to a booth in the corner and ate their food. As they sat down, Izuku and Bakugo did a quick canvass of the restaurant, but didn't spot their target. They then began to eat, and Izuku had to ask, why do you always have to order spicy food? Yeah, just because you can't handle spicy food that well, doesn't mean I can't have it. Besides, KFC is one of the few places where their spicy option is actually spicy, Bakugo said. Izuku waved his hand in front of his eyes, as his eyes were getting a bit watery. Well, whatever they do, it's making my eyes water. Izuku took a small sip of his drink as he looked over the restaurant, keeping an eye on the entrance. Yet no one matching the photo entered. The restaurant was quiet until around 5:10, when a man wearing a gray jacket and black baseball cap walked in. As he walked it, he took off his baseball cap and hooked it to one of his belt loops. While the man walked up to the counter to order his food, Izuku knocked Bakugo's elbow and nodded towards the man. Bikago paused in his eating to look over in the direction Izuku nodded. He looked over at the man in the gray jacket. It was identical to the photo Maro had presented to them. Bakugo looked over at Izuku and nodded, then went back to his food. Yes, but switch the coleslaw out for 2 biscuits, the man said as he pulled out his wallet. The worker nodded as they entered the order, and then asked for payment, and the man was more than happy to pay. After receiving the receipt, the man walked to a table. A few minutes later, a worker walked out with the man's order and walked over to the man's table. The man thanked the worker and then began to enjoy his meal. Izuku and Bakugo kept a close eye on the man as he ate his food. They took shifts to keep the man in their peripheral vision, and to keep up appearances, Izuku got a refill on his drink. When he got back, he noticed that a few extra of his fries were gone. Izuku didn't question it as he sat back down. The man was quick to eat his meal, and when he was down, he slipped his baseball cap back on and left his tray by the trash bin. As the man left the building, Izuku checked his phone and saw that it was 5:42, so he looked over at Bakugo, who was doing the same. Then, without a word, they stood up and casually walked out of the restaurant, but not before they refilled their drinks again. Outside of the restaurant, Izuku was the first to spot the black baseball cap, which he pointed out with his drink. Bakugo nodded, and they followed their mark, never getting further than 15 meters away. Further down the road, Bakugo rechecked his phone to note the time. The meeting location must be closed by, since it happens in 9 minutes and he's walking. Their target had reached a crosswalk and was waiting for it. So in turn, Bakugo and Izuku slowed their pace down, taking sips of their drinks to keep up appearances. We're heading west, towards downtown. The drug targets usually go north, Izuku said, as he downed the rest of his drink and threw it into a trash bin as they walked past one. The crosswalk light switched to white, and their target began walking across the street. So Izuku and Bakugo returned to normal walking speed, and as they reached the crosswalk, the target was already across. Maro's probably throwing us for a loop. There's always some new in Theses test, and he has been telling us lately that not all villains are the same, Bakugo said, to which Izuku agreed with a nod. They walked across the street and continued to follow their target. As they walked, they kept a close eye on their target, while doing very well to make it appear they weren't tailing someone. Izuku had his phone out and headphones in, to make appear he was looking at videos online, though his phone was muted, while Bakugo was playing a game. They kept a steady pace behind their target, and the only time they lost sight of their target was when a group of college students came out of a restaurant and momentarily blocked their views. Izuku and Bakugo were quick to walk around the group and spotted their target a little further down the road than they were expecting, yet they didn't increase their pace to catch up. Izuku then looked around to see where they were headed. He's headed to some warehouses, Izuku said, as he pulled out his headphones and slipped his phone into his pocket after turning it off. He walked a little faster as the target disappeared between 2 warehouses. Bakugo quickly caught up, and they looked around the corner and saw the target pull out a key and walk inside.